And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to the live chat. I have two very special guests with me here to count down our top 10 greatest middleweights of all time. Firstly, we have the boxing librarian from Hardline Boxing Channel. Welcome, BL.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invite. I've been looking forward to this live stream that the three of us have arranged, and I'm looking forward to not only going through my list that has changed multiple times over the last few weeks, but also seeing how you guys see it, to see if, you know, I could have thought of something a different way, maybe amend me thinking here or there, which is one reason why I love doing countdowns like this, because while I'm giving my list, I'm also listening to you two great guys give your list and some reasoning, and sometimes it can affect my thinking and make me think a different way. So it's always a good learning experience, and it's always good to have a good discussion to highlight these fighters to the boxing fans.
Fantastic. It's great to have you. We also have Scrapbook Boxing from Scrapbook Boxing's Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs. Scrap, what's up, my friend?
Random. BL, I'm doing well. It's a pleasure being on the panel. And I'm looking forward to a very good discussion. This is probably one of the most difficult discussions you can have because of the weight division. Middleweight is unbelievable, the amount of fighters they had. So I'm enjoying this conversation so far. I'm looking forward to seeing where we place these fighters.
Yeah, absolutely. There might be a touch of noise in my background at times. I'll mute myself when not talking. Shout out to 86 Boxing in the chat. Thanks for coming through. Josh City. Shout out to Bruce. Andre left us a comment a few days ago talking about he can't miss the live stream. So hopefully, Andre, you're here. Thanks to everyone who shows up after the fact. We appreciate it. This is a monumental list to try and compile. I'm completely out of my depth. But we're just going to go ahead and plow ahead with it because if I wait till I had full knowledge of all these eras, then we'd never get to do it. And I think with everybody, it's just a learning process. So before we start, so we did not set a criteria. We just wanted to kind of wing it and just go by however we felt in the moment. I made multiple lists. I don't know if you guys did. I made 3 lists. I'm not happy with any of them. I feel like I'm leaving someone out. It's only 10 slots. It's very fierce. There's way more than 10 legends who have epic careers at middleweight, to put it mildly. So let me ask you first, BL, when you think of regarding a list like this, we're talking about one weight class, what resonates with you in terms of greatness? It's such a broad term, but what does greatness mean to you as far as when we're trying to judge fighters from a specific weight class all throughout history, all the different rule sets and judging criterias and things?
Well, there's a number of things I look for, but I've kept my criteria very loose, and I'm going more on an instinct, because the problem is with the changes in boxing from now to the past, you had a scenario now where everything's very tight. If a fight is 1 pound over or ½ pound over, he cannot fight at middleweight. He has to make the scales, or it's no longer for a middleweight title, for example. Back in the day, they could sign contracts at middleweight at 157, 158, 159. They could even have middleweight fights at 162 that people now call light heavyweight fights, but they were not light heavyweight fights. They were middleweight fights. They were just signed at that weight. That was the weight agreement. So it's very hard to create a criteria and go through many of these older fighters and nail down every fight they had, which was a legitimate middleweight fight. So basically how I've approached this with the differences is just thinking about the fighters overall, and thinking about what they did and who they beat, and just kind of out of the ether of my mind, shredded mind, I'll say, at end of doing the list, just come up with an idea of, who I think the 10 best fighters are at middleweight. Regardless, it could be based on the skills, it could be based on the traits, it could be based on the resume, anything.
That's totally fair. And I like these with the floating criteria where we have no set standard. We're just thinking about greatness, and it's a personal list, like all these lists are, but we're not even trying to put boundaries on it. And that opens up the opportunity to talk about more great fighters that resonate with us. And Scrapbook, can I ask you the same question? What does greatness mean to you when you're trying to narrow it down and just look at one weight class?
Well, one of the things I look at when I look at greatness, I look at your potential, exercising your full potential. Not only your potential and where you stand at the moment, but your potential beyond your boundaries, living outside the box. That's what greatness means to me, because if you can see it, it's a very good chance you can reach it, but you have to have all the intangibles. So when I look at greatness, I want to see who you are, what your identity is. And the only way you can discover that is when you're tested. And once you're tested to its fullest limits, then I'll judge you from there. To give you an example, there's some middleweights who fought way above their weight divisions, light heavyweights and heavyweights, but they still fought at middleweight. So that tells me that they can fight their very best outside their boundaries. I judge them that way as well. So even if they didn't have as many wins as someone who fought in their own weight divisions, that still gives them a lot more for me to judge them by. So greatness is a pretty good criteria when you look at it from a broad perspective, but when you look at it head on, it really tells you the answer. So for me, greatness is living out your true potential. Don't let it go to waste. Once your career is over, it's over. So that's how I look at it.
Very good. Okay, so who would like to start with their number 10? BL, would you like to start for us?
Yes, I will indeed start now. To all the listeners, this is a tough list. I had to leave certain fighters out that I'm not entirely happy about, but you know, there's only 10 places in a top 10. There's not 15. Okay, so I had to make decisions. My number 10, okay, my number 10 on my 10 greatest middleweights of all time is one of the strongest, to me, middleweights of all time in terms of physical strength and his ability to impose his strength on his opponents, and that is Freddie Steele. Freddie Steele had an immaculate-looking record. You know, he only had 5 defeats in nearly 140 professional fights, also scored well over a half-century of knockouts. To me, Freddie Steele is one of those great fighters who goes very undervalued. I find that when people talk about top 10 middleweights, he's very, very rarely involved. But when you look at the list of fighters he's fought or beat at middleweight, you know, from Gorilla Jones, okay, beating Joe Glick at middleweight, even decent fighters like Andy Devode, who were trial horses, but very tough trial horses. You know, Baby Joe Gans, you know, he stopped him early. He's also fought and beaten fighters like Fred Apostoli, you know, Gorilla Jones, Vince Dundee. All of this were even before winning the middleweight title. Then when he won middleweight title, okay, against Eddie Babe Risco, you know, where he won the NSAC and NBA middleweight titles, he then went on to have a fantastic run where he beat decent fighters, okay, like Young Stooley. He beat Alan Matthews, who were a really, really good contender. You know, he beat fighters like Gus Lesnovich, okay, who would then go on to be like heavyweight champions. Also beating really, really tough, dependable fighters like Paul Perone and Frank Battaglia, and many others. And he did have a little mini run as world champion. You know, he did knock out Ken Overlin. You know, a lot of people don't realize, you know, that when knocking out Ken Overlin was no easy task. Ken Overlin is a fighter who, when Freddie Steele fought him, he was approaching the 100 fight mark. Okay, he just had about a dozen defeats, if I recall. But basically, Ken Overlin was referred to as poor man's Harry Greb. He was a very hard fighter to beat, you know, at his best. And to say that Freddie Steele were battling an experienced Ken Overlin and stopped him in early rounds is quite a testament. You know, he did eventually, you know, also have a number of defeats. The only real fighters to beat him were fighters like Apostoli, Al Hostak, fighters like this. So an excellent run, a middleweight title run with a number of defenses, also top level opposition with very, very few defeats against that top level of opposition. And, you know, many of fighters I've named here either went on to be middleweight or like heavyweight champions. You know, Lesnovich, courtesy at War and a certain avoidance of Bivens, went on to be a long-time lineal light heavyweight champion. But a lot of tough fighters he fought in there, you know, from the Gorilla Joneses and the Vince Dundees. He destroyed Vince Dundee. I mean, Freddie Steele battered Vince Dundee, who is no slouch either, former middleweight champion. You know, so when you've mixed in that company and you've shown that you can either match or beat most of the best opponents you've fought, then to me, you deserve to be in the top 10.
Absolutely. That's a fitting tribute. Scrap, would you like to add to that or move to your number 10 listing?
Well, Freddie Steele is in my top 10 as well. I'm just going to go ahead and say, BL, that was a great choice in placing him in number 10, in my opinion, because of the amount of middleweights that you have. But what he has done out of Tacoma, Washington, here's a young man who was very frail. He was a skinny young man. He didn't look like he would be much of a fighter, but he learned very quickly. And when he knocked out Anton Christopheridis, that told me all I needed to know about Freddie Steele. He knocked him out in 2 rounds. Freddie Steele was a very hard puncher. Outside of Billy Patrol, he was the hardest body puncher with a left hook that I've ever seen. He was a devastating puncher. So Freddie Steele, in my opinion, deserves to be on this list. And number 10, I think that's a safe place to put him. Great choice, BL.
Thank you, Scrap. Appreciate that.
So was that also your number 10, Scrap?
I'm going to put him at number 10 because as we were talking backstage, there's so many different names to place these men, positions. So I think number 10 would be Freddie Steele for me as well. And that's why I think I agree with BL on that, because that was a great choice. Freddie Steele, he's in the list, so that's important. Number 10, I think, is where he belongs.
Fantastic. So for my number 10, I was a little torn. I ended up going with the executioner, Bernard Hopkins. I couldn't put him higher than 10 because of the size of some of the resumes above him, but I think the fact that he collected all the belts in the multi-belt era, I think a lot of times fans talk about the good old days when there were less titles floating around, where it was harder to become a champion. But not often mentioned is how difficult it is to collect all the different belts and make the mandatories and pay the fees and basically work it out within the business of the athlete to accumulate and hold all the belts. And his run he made, from I think 01 to 05 is undisputed. As part of a 1988 to 2016 career, an incredible career, Hopkins started late. He made, I believe, 19 defenses against 17 different opponents, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he was Fighter of the Year for 2001 as well. So I wanted to give him a shout for that tremendous success. And BL, something you were saying backstage about consistency, he was able to maintain that with the eyes of the world on him, where he held all the belts at a very prestigious weight. He was able to maintain it all. So the overall strength of his era, there may have been stronger eras, but that consistent success and managing to navigate all the sanctioning bodies is pretty darn great to me. And I had to give him a shout at number 10. BL, would you like to present your number 9?
Yes, my number 9, okay, is one of the fighters I love in boxing history. And the reason I love this fighter is he was not afraid to take challenges. He was an outstanding middleweight fighter. Again, physically a very strong middleweight fighter, a bit like a Marcel Sedan type, powerful upper body, squat and strong, powerful hooker, had lots of stamina, had a great chin. It's the toy bulldog, Mickey Walker. Reasons why I put Mickey Walker number 10, I think he was one of the best middleweight fighters of all time, regardless of resume or titles or accomplishments won. I think he was one of the greatest middleweight fighters of all time. And thinking about Mickey Walker, he actually was a former welterweight champion for approximately 3.5 years. Lost a middleweight challenge in one of the last great battles of Harry Greb in 1925. But then actually won the middleweight title when he bet Tiger Flowers. And he was lineal middleweight champion from 26 to 31 before vacating to go up in weight, where he would later challenge for a light heavyweight strap. He'd fight people like Braddock, Bearcat Wright, he'd fight all kinds of people. He even got top 10 rated at heavyweight and top 10 rated at light heavyweight. But at middleweight, I think Mickey Walker's one of those fighters who would have been a cross-generational fighter. He would have been a tough opponent for any middleweight champion in boxing history. Mickey Walker would have been an easy fight for no one. And when you add the lineal reign, the fact he came up in weight to have a near 5-year lineal middleweight title reign. He didn't make overly too many defenses in his career, because back then fighters didn't quite fight that way. But even the fighters he fought, from Tommy Milligan, who was a very tough, dependable contender, he beat the excellent Ace Hopkins twice, who was, to me, a major contender from 20s who goes very, very underrated. He bet the Deacon from Georgia, Tiger Flowers himself. He lost the great battle to Harry Greb. So, yeah, Mickey Walker for me is a number 9, a very worthy top 10 middleweight of all time.
Fantastic choice. Yo, shout out to 86 Boxing, Nick Harmer, and Rodolfo. Thanks, guys, for coming in. Just great to see everybody here. And fantastic choice, BL. Quality choice there, Mr. Walker. Incredible fighter and a multi-weight fighter. and someone who didn't wait to put on the size to move up. He was moving up, like some of the other greats, he was moving up before he was physically fully in that realm. Scrapbook, I believe we're on your number 9, sir.
Yes, my number 9 is Homan Williams. Homan Williams, he was a hell of a fighter. He would begin boxing in 1928. He'd have 38 matches successfully. 1932, he would spar with Melly Jackson, who we know as to be Henry Armstrong. It was in preparation for the 1932 Los Angeles Games under the AAU National Championships, who was the coach, the first American black coach, turned out to be Harry Wiley Sr. Herman Williams would turn pro the same year, August 12, 1932, and he faced Battling Dizzy. And that told me a lot when I read about that fight, what this young man was pretty much made of. He was also in the ring with Baby Tiger Flowers. He would face the NBA World Featherweight Champion, that was Tommy Paul. He was in the ring with Johnny Pena and battling Ballino. Ballino had a vacant crown that he pretty much gave up, and that's what he fought for. And he turned pro. He saw a lot of opportunity, and believe it or not, Joe Louis is why, what really inspired him to continue boxing, because he was going to stop boxing. And Joe Louis's combination, the famous combination in 1941 when he would knock out Billy Conn, that combination came from Homan Williams because they had the same brain thrust. And when you look at fighters such as Homan Williams and Charlie Burley and a lot of these Black Murderers Row fighters, they didn't have the opportunities that they so rightly deserved, but they made the best of it. And Homan Williams showed you through featherweight all the way up to as far as heavyweight is concerned, because he got up into middleweight, but he trained and did exhibitions with heavyweights, that a fighter who is at a base weight of middleweight can challenge himself in any direction. And that's what we talked about backstage as well. As a middleweight, he fought featherweights, he fought heavyweight, so he was there in the middle as middleweight. So I had to put him as number 9 because I couldn't put him any higher. Obviously, he didn't win a world title, but he was in there with fighters such as Jake LaMotta and Marcel Sedan. I mean, he fought so many great fighters in his career. So I wanted to make sure I gave him mention. I think he deserves number 9 spot. And when you look at Homan Williams, I have him ranked number 1 as the greatest Black Murderers Row fighter. Think of greatness, because he was something else.
Absolutely. He was one of the guys I struggled with. And yeah, it was a shame, really. This would have been easier to make a top 20, so I wouldn't feel I was robbing anyone of credit. But what a great fighter he was. And doesn't get his full credit today, but perhaps that can change. People come in and out of favor over time. From what you've said, BL, Ezra Charles wasn't always remembered properly for his great achievements.
Oh no, back in the 90s, only real hardcore boxing fans knew of him. The regular boxing fans had never heard of him. Now he gets all this praise now with social media. But Scrap will remember those days when he spoke to some people and mentioned Ezra Charles, and they'd say, "Who's that?" Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Right, he might be one of those fighters who, for a time at least, was remembered mostly for certain fighters he lost to, or like say the Rocky fight. But in his own right, I mean, he has 20 wins over Hall of Famers, so which puts him if I'm not mistaken, BL, that puts him 4th, only behind Harry Greb, Sam Langford, and Ray Robinson. He's
That's right. Yeah,
Robinson.
I believe that is right, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he is 4th on that list. Yeah.
Right, and fighting worthy Hall of Famers. These aren't guys who got in out of sympathy. These are guys who got it, who deserve to be in there. So Ezra Charles, it's one of those guys.
Joey Maxim, all these guys, Charlie Burley, yeah.
Absolutely. So for my number 10, after a lot of hand wringing, I ended up going. Now. I mean, sorry, number 9. I went with the toy bulldog Mickey Walker, who. His first attempt to take the welterweight title against the great Harry Greb, he did not succeed, but he didn't let that bother him. He was a phenomenal welterweight, quite possibly one of the most able welterweight champions of all time. But he moved up. He did take the middleweight title. BL, you already touched on his career in a little bit of detail, but yeah, you said 26-31. He was the middleweight champion, and he was prepared to challenge himself and move higher and higher. And he did even compete at heavyweight, but he was fighting at light heavyweight before he was properly a light heavyweight. He was willing to go up against the odds to challenge himself. So I had to give Mickey Walker a shout.
If I may add one other point, just to back us point on this random, people also have to remember with Mickey Walker, I pointed out that he actually vacated his title. None of middleweight contenders could take it from him. You know, with tragic loss of Addy Greb and then tragic loss of later Tiger Flowers, there were no other middleweights there who were really a threat to him. He was the dominant middleweight king for those years with Greb, and then sadly Flowers lost to us. He was the dominant king, so he was actually unbeaten middleweight champion at world. He never lost that title. He gave it up to go to light heavyweight.
That's a great point. And beat the man who beat the man, you know, beat Flowers who beat Greb. So the lineage there, as far as it wasn't like some vacant title or some guy who won an upset and like some soft attempt, like with Greb when he took the title from Wilson. Wilson wasn't, I wouldn't say it was even one of his 10 or maybe even 15 best opponents. He just happened to be the guy who had the title at that time. Not so with Walker. He beat a great fighter who had beaten an all-time great fighter to get his title. And like you said, he held it and ended up giving it up to go campaign at heavyweight. So phenomenal.
If I could add one more point, random, if I may.
Please.
Just that listeners out there, always remember with Mickey Walker, think about him, what he must have been like as a middleweight, considering that as a heavyweight, okay, he was as small as he was a middleweight, he weighed a bit more, but he stood on the inside and was trying to check hook and push back Max Schmeling. So imagine how tough a proposition he was at middleweight when he's fighting a heavyweight Hall of Famer and standing his ground and fighting him punch for punch. Incredible.
Yeah, it really is. Toy Bulldog is such a fantastic nickname aesthetically, but also it's an apt description of this man's mentality, where he really was, as he's moving up, you know, he's pretty fearless. He took on some insane challenges for a man his size.
He got dropped by Bearcat Wright. If I recall correctly from fight reports I read, he got dropped by Bearcat Wright in first round, was groggy and all over the place. This were at heavyweight, but if I remember it, next round he came out and he dropped Bearcat Wright. Dropped him to the floor with a huge hook. Clean punch, bang, dropped him. And the fight went on now. I can't remember if that was a draw. I don't know if Scrapbook will remember. Did it become a draw? But, you know, that's what kind of fighter he was. No give up. He'd get hurt. He'd come back. He'd fight. He was a real fighter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that fight was a draw. I'm sorry, Random. I was just answering. That fight was a draw. And to add to what you're saying, Mickey Walker, he was in a ring with Dave Shade out of California. Dave Shade had faced a fighter by the name of Jimmy Slattery. He was out of Buffalo. And Jimmy Slattery was a light heavyweight. Dave Shade was a middleweight, moved up to light heavyweight. Mickey Walker was a welterweight, moving up to middleweight. So it just goes to show you the caliber of fighters that Mickey Walker was in a ring with. Pete Latzo, who was a welterweight, wound up moving up to a light heavyweight eventually as well. He took on Tommy Loughran. But Mickey Walker was a fascinating puncher. After the fight with Harry Greb in 25, they went to a bar. And both these guys were, as they call, throwing in the nightcap. And Mickey Walker just kept on heckling Harry Greb. Harry Greb, if you feel that way, let's go outside. They went outside. As Harry Greb was taking off his jacket, Mickey Walker hit him from behind the head, and they started, you know, he picked him up and body slammed him, and they started wrestling, and they broke it up. Just to show you what type of person he was. He was not the kind of person to be played with, but he was a brutal fighter on the inside, man. He was something else. Remember when he knocked out Tom Ellikin? Great fighter was Mickey Walker. No question about it.
Yeah, great point, Scrap. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, BL. So I think we've now reached your number 8 selection.
Right. Well, my number 8 selection might cause a bit of controversy.
I think mine too.
It's actually Gennady Golovkin. No, I'm joking. It's not Golovkin. No, sorry, I'm trolling. Sorry, Ron. Sorry, Scott. No, my number 7 is actually Tommy Ryan, and I'm aware of some criticism Tommy Ryan gets, and some of it's justified and some of it is not. I heard Benny Leonard get that same criticism for years when it was untrue. But speaking purely on boxing, okay, Tommy Ryan didn't fight some fighters he could have fought, although his weight at that time, there weren't that many he could have fought anyway. He'd have had to go up to light heavyweight or even heavyweight. But he did reign as world welterweight champion in 1800s, and then he became a near 8-year lineal middleweight champion, which was actually a middleweight record for decades. Tommy Ryan, people don't realize, held the longest lineal middleweight reign for decades, okay, which is no mean feat. Now, he defended that title a number of times. Now, he didn't fight all comers, okay? He fought a lot of good fighters in his career, really, really underrated fighters like the real McCoy, Charles Kid McCoy, who had fast hands, were a brutish fighter, very, very tough fighter, Charles Kid McCoy. He were one of few men in well over 100 fights who could actually beat Tommy Ryan. Tommy Ryan fought Tommy West, okay, a real, real tough contender. You know, he beat him twice. He also beat Jack Bonner, another super tough contender at the time, one of the best contenders at the time around that time. Tommy Ryan beat him twice. He also beat former coloured middleweight champion Frank Craig. Never got to fight Joe Butler, I don't believe, another former coloured middleweight champion who maybe he could have fought. But he did beat Frank Craig, and he also bet George Green on a few occasions. And George Green, of course, would become known as Young Corbett the First, starting that fantastic little set of young George Green going to Young Corbett the Second, going to Young Corbett the Third, of course, the greater fighter of the three. But Tommy Ryan, I think in his time, he was a fantastic boxer. He also was a very, very heavy puncher. Okay, Tommy Ryan has lots of knockouts and lots of early knockouts. He had good technique. He applied his punches with accuracy and finesse. And due to that, got a lot of leverage on his punches. He could knock a lot of fighters out early. Has lots of early knockouts and lots of knockouts in total, as well as setting that trend-setting near 8-year lineal middleweight reign, which, like I say, stood for decades as a boxing record. So yeah, Tommy Ryan is my number 8, sorry.
Fantastic choice. Yeah, what a great fighter and stylist he was. Scrapbook, your number 8, sir.
My number 8, I just want to reference what BL just stated as far as Tommy Ryan is concerned. He's very underrated. He's not on many individuals' list. I don't have him on this list because of the amount of middleweights that we have to discuss, but he is a very underrated middleweight, and I do respect his name very well. But my number 8 middleweight is Bob James Fitzsimmons, Ruby Rob. Here's a man who stood 5'11.5 inches, had a 71.5-inch reach. He was a middleweight, heavyweight, and then light heavyweight. Very interesting. He had a total bout career of 101 fights, 69 wins, 57 knockouts, and 12 losses. He faced Peter Maher, Joe Tawinski. He faced Ernst Pearl Martin and Edward Starr Rowlands twice. Those names are interesting. Why? Because they were two black fighters. They got opportunities not when he was champion, but they were very good and outstanding fighters for their day. Bob also faced a fighter by the name of Ed Duncanhurst. What's interesting about him, he fought him April 30th, 1900 at the Hercules Athletic Club in Brooklyn, New York. That was his 86th bout. What's interesting about that, 140 pounds weight difference between these two men. And that goes to show you the type of fighter Bob Fitzsimmons was. He defeated Jim Hall for the Australian Middleweight Championship crown, January 19th, 1889. Defeated world middleweight champion non-Perel Jack Dempsey, January 14th, 1891. He lost the world heavyweight championship crown to James J. Jeffries, June 9th, 1899 in Coney Island at the Athletic Club. That was his 83rd bout. He defeated Sailor Tom Sharkey, August 4th, 1900 in Coney Island. That was at the Athletic Club. That was 88th bout. He defeated George Gardner on November 25th, 1903 at the Mechanics Pavilion. He won the World Light Heavyweight Championship crown. That was his 94th bout. What's interesting about Bob Fitzsimmons that we just learned about? Here's a man who was the middleweight champion. He moved up to the heavyweight and challenged a young man, knocked him out with the famous solar plexus punch. His name was James Corbett. And he lost to Jeffries, but then he went down to the light heavyweight division in 1903, and he took on George Gardner. The only man who I can think of that came close to that was Roy Jones 100 years later, but the interesting about that was Jones moved back down to fight Tarver, and he was KO'd because of the weight drain. So it just goes to show you what type of fighter Bob Fitzsimmons was. He was always a middleweight, moved up a little bit to fight heavyweight, but he kept his weight, and he still had the ability to knock men out. I have to put him on his list as number 8. Great fighter, Bob Fitzsimmons.
Yeah, can I jump in random and say fantastic breakdown, Scott? Really, really impressive. And a few things I'd like to add to that great breakdown Scott's just done there is Scrap will be fully aware of this. Bob Fitzsimmons was one of the great one-punch knockout fighters of his time. very, very impressive knockout record. And even like Scrap alluded to and pointed out, he'd sometimes fight men much bigger than himself, but he still had the power to knock fighters out. And I read an old interview with Bob Fitzsimmons in 1890s. There was a newspaper interview with him. And what they were asking him about his ferocious punch power. He could knock big men out with single shots, and he'd throw his punches very straight and very accurate, and he'd hit certain parts of the body. And when I read this newspaper interview, it's fascinating when you read some of these old, where they do big newspaper spread where they interview him, and he said that what he used to do with his sparring partners sometimes would stand there and he'd practice hitting them in different places, and then he'd see what the sparring partner's reaction was. They'd say, "Oh, that's really bad there. I don't like being hit there. Oh, I didn't feel that too bad." He learned over time where to apply his punches to get the maximum effect. Fantastic fighter.
Oh,
yeah, that's a great point. He definitely advanced the sweet science and was able to prove it above his own weight. So literally, like pound for pound, greatness. So I believe that brings us, Scrapbook, to your number 8, is it?
Yeah, that's Bob Fitzsimmons.
Yeah. It's you, Random.
Oh, you both went with Fitz. Yeah, that's a good call. So
I
almost
went with Ryan. Scrap went with Fitz.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's right. You added on. See, I'm already confused myself. You guys are making me second guess myself as we go through this list. But I'm gonna stay with what I had, because Fitz was definitely in that consideration. For my number 8. Let me find my graphic here. Was almost Fitz. I ended up going with the Michigan assassin, Stanley Ketchel, who died young, but he was so intense as a middleweight champion. When he died, there was a lot of, you guys can back me up on this, there was a lot of question about who was the man at middleweight. For some years after his passing, he was on that level where, while he was the middleweight champion, and this is boxing's middleweight. This isn't mixed martial arts middleweight that's 185 pounds. This is boxing's middleweight. He challenged the great Jack Johnson, and Johnson was doing his normal thing, playing with the guy, shutting him down. But then Ketchel uncorked an enormous punch and actually knocked Jack Johnson off his feet. He did get knocked out right after that when Johnson got mad, but just to show the size of the set this guy had on him, he was far smart, gave up huge amount of weight in that fight. But he had excellent wins at middleweight, and this was coming off of being a powerful welterweight champion. So Ketchel was someone who showed continued success, and he was cut off young, but he did some really great things in his career, and before he was murdered on his farm by Walter Dipley. But what he did do was pretty remarkable, and I thought he deserved a shout, especially for being such a hard hitter. Similar to Fitzsimmons, not the same dimensions as Fitzsimmons, but a very hard hitter for his size. It's certainly as evidenced by knocking Johnson off his feet, because there were great fighters with much more weight on them than Ketchel who couldn't knock Johnson off his feet at various points in his career. Like, that was a serious thing, especially when he managed to do it. At that time, Johnson was, practically untouchable, and at the height of his powers. I don't know if he was still in his physical prime when they fought, but Johnson, because he'd been fighting a long time, but certainly he wasn't someone anyone could play around with. Much larger guys from Ketchel had much less success. Like Al Kaufman, one of the top contenders who he fought, Johnson just made him look stupid. And that wasn't the case with Ketchel. So shout out to Stanley Ketchel. And I don't know if you guys want to add to that at all, but or we can just move right on to number 7.
Yeah, I'll go through Ketchel when I get to him, because I can discuss him then, if that's okay. It's just I don't want to say everything now and then get to him on my list.
Right. Well, go ahead with your number 7 then, sir. Let's move to that.
Right. I'll play pop quiz to the chat. What we're talking about, with my next pick, is a fighter, and some people may not be aware of this. I'll see if Random and Scrap will pick up. But this fighter was regarded as one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world for years. From 1914-15 up until 1919-1920, this fighter was regarded as one of the best fighters in the entire world. Now, he did not get a proper shot at the middleweight title, because a whole number of the fighters at middleweight, didn't really fancy actually going up against him. So, ultimately, he didn't get his opportunity there to be a middleweight champion. But what he did do, okay, is this fighter fought some of the greatest fighters in that era, including beating the great Harry Greb himself. He also won and lost to the great Jerome Jeffers, Jeff Smith. Okay, he also fought and beat fighters, you know, like Soldier Bartfield. He fought and beat George Chip multiple times. Fought Mike O'Dowd, okay, more than once. Also fought and beat tough fighters, you know, like Dave Rosenberg, Augie Ratner, you know, as well as many others. My number 7 is actually Mike Gibbons. Now, some people may say, you know, well, BL is not a champion. You have champions below him. To me, champion doesn't eclipse everything. You know, being a champion is just one aspect, okay? But to me, Mike Gibbons, a fighter who only, you know, had 11 defeats in nearly 140 fights. Like I said, you know, from when he beat Greb, he was on a winning run, and he stayed on a winning run all that time after beating Harry Greb, which were in 1917, and Greb were on a 16-fight win run, you know. And also consider that recently, not long before beating Greb, this fantastic fighter, he had lost to Packy McFarland. He'd also beaten Leo Florian Hook, another all-time great. But he'd also got a trio of wins shortly before beating Greb of Jeff Smith, Ted Kid Lewis, and Jack Dillon on the trot. Okay, he beat Jeff Smith, Ted Kid Lewis, and Jack Dillon, then scored a win over Clay Turner before then beating Harry Greb. And then he went on an entire unbeaten run again until later in 1919, you know, when Harry Greb finally beat him in the rematch. And even after beating Harry Greb, he beat George Chip on more than one occasion. He beat Soldier Bartfield a few occasions. He beat Leo Florian Hook again. You know, to me, Mike Gibbons is one of the greatest fighters of all time. You know, whether it's the knockout win over Eddie McGaughty, another super tough fighter from that time. Sometimes titles mean a lot, and other times the resume can mean a lot. And, you know, sometimes I can rate a fighter based on resume over a champion, even though the title tag is more of historical acclaim. At the end of the day, beating legendary fighters is also, to me, a historical acclaim that can sometimes overwhelm a champion. So for me, my number 7 is the great St. Paul Phantom, Mike Gibbons. He won and lost to Harry Greb. He didn't get the fight against Klaus he wanted. He didn't get the title shot against O'Dowd. He fought O'Dowd, okay, lost on points over 10 rounds. You know, this were an O'Dowd who'd only got 10 defeats in nearly 80 fights. You know, he beat a whole number of world champions and lineal champions, a whole number of Hall of Fame fighters. And what can I say? He beat Harry Greb at middleweight, and he beat Leo Hook. I'm sorry, if you beat my Leo, you're in my top 10.
Absolutely. I know that's one of your favorites, Leo Florian Hook. So that was, let me think. So that was your number 7. Is that correct?
Yes, my number 7, Mike Gibbons.
And a worthy entry he is. Scrapbook, would you like to present your number 7, sir?
Absolutely. And the reason I love this list is because we get an opportunity to give many fighters shine. My number 7 is going to be Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter. Jerome Jefford. He was born April 23rd, 1891 in New York. He was originally from Brooklyn. Then he would reside to Harlem, New York, where he would spar many rounds with Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson was the middleweight champion. He would defeat Mike O'Dowd, who was out of St. Paul, for that title. Now, Jeff Smith stood 5'9", weighed 155 to 166 pounds. He fought from 1910 to 1927. Had a record of 190 total bouts. He was an incredible fighter. He was in a ring with the Pittsburgh Mill, Harry Greb, 7 separate occasions. And he didn't defeat Harry Greb, but he was in there with him. And that's one of the reasons why I use a criteria the way I use it, because I give fighters opportunities for what, you know, heading outside the box, what they try to accomplish. He was in a ring with Eddie McGaughty. Eddie McGaughty was an outstanding fighter. Les Darcy as well, out of Australia. He was in a ring with Mike Gibbons. Mike Gibbons was the St. Paul Phantom, BL's number 7 pick, which in my opinion is a very good pick. Now, Mike Gibbons was the older brother of Tommy Gibbons. Tommy Gibbons only lost 7 fights, and Tommy Gibbons was an outstanding light heavyweight. But Mike Gibbons, who's the older brother, I believe was the better fighter. He was also in a ring with, like I said, Harry Greb and Gene Tunney, George Robinson, Jamaica Kid, Zulu Kid, Joe Burrell, George Chip, Bob Moha, Jimmy Clabby, Clay Turner, Chuck Wiggins, Les Darcy, Willie Lewis, Michael Dowd, Frank Manning, Eddie McCarthy, Jimmy Clabby, George Compartier. He's the only fighter who fought all over the world 3 separate occasions. And he had, based on the books you read, he could have had 300 fights or even more. So Jeff Smith, in my opinion, definitely I believe he belongs on this list. He's a great fighter. He fought everybody that you can think of during his time. So I had to represent Jeff Smith, the Bayonne Globetrotter. Great fighter he was.
Absolutely. And what a tough schedule that man fought. Even amongst tough schedules, you look at it and you go, my goodness, talk about challenging himself. Very underrated, maybe not remembered today the way he should be, but certainly in his day, he was respected for the tough proposition he was against all manner of great fighters. So for my number 7, I actually went with the same thing as BL. I went with the great Mike Gibbons. In a career, like, talk about underrepresented in world title fights. Like, I mean, there are fighters like Sam Langford and Harry Wills in boxing who were denied world title shots but fought for colored heavyweight titles. And in Langford's case, more than just the heavyweight title. But Mike Gibbons, just as a white dude, just didn't get his opportunity, his full opportunity for world honors. But his resume is absolutely ridiculous. And if I've got this right, he's got multiple wins over Willie Lewis, multiple wins over Jeff Smith. He beat Patty Lavin, Bill K. O'Brien, Sid Burns, Jack McCarran, Kid Graves, Al McCoy, Jimmy Clabby, Eddie McGordy, couple wins over Leo Hook, Ted Kid Lewis, couple wins over Jack Dillon, the great Harry Greb, George Chip, Soldier Barfield, Michael Dowd, I mean, and Clay Turner, like you mentioned. I mean, just a ridiculous number of victims versus very few setbacks, you know, and his official like decision fight record is excellent, and his including the newspaper decisions is also supremely excellent. So I had to give him a shout. What a great fighter, and a worthy Hall of Famer, regardless of just like other greats, regardless of title opportunity. The lists on his ledger outweigh many of the champions throughout history to me. So I had to give him the shout. And I believe that gets us down to our number 6. Am I correct?
Yes, it's my number 6 now. I'm going to try and sell him a little bit here, okay? But my number 6, okay, is Gennady. No, I'm joking. My number 6 is actually Bernard Hopkins. Okay. Now some people will think, "Whoa, BL, you're going off on one there." Bernard Hopkins doesn't have the best resume, but like I said, I'm looking at a whole number of things, not just the overall resume. You know, this is one where Mike Gibbons gets in based on that incredible resume, his long win runs, his legendary win runs against great fighters. Hopkins goes in my top 10 for slightly different reasons. Point 1, he's the first fighter in boxing history to become undisputed champion, winning all 4 belts. Now, he first won the title in the rematch with Segundo Mercado. He should have probably won the first fight, but actually won the second fight, and then went on a run of complete 11 title defenses, okay, including beating John David Jackson, former light middleweight champion, beating Glenn Johnson, who were 32-0, okay, beating Simon Brown, a middleweight champion, beating Antoine Eccles, etc. Okay, by his 12th defense, okay, he then added his first unification fight against Keith Holmes, who were 36-2. He were on a win run. He were a legit top 10 rated middleweight at the time. He beat Keith Holmes, okay, and then in his next fight, he added another title by beating Felix Tito Trinidad, who'd won the title off 4-time middleweight champion William Joppy. So Hopkins suddenly added, after 11 defenses, defense 12 he adds WBC in unification, 13th defense he adds WBA in unification. He makes 4 more defenses, okay, including beating Joppy and beating Robert Allen, before going into final unification with Oscar De La Hoya in defense number 18, where he added the WBO title. He then made a defense against Howard Eastman. Okay, Howard Eastman, who only had 1 defeat in 41 fights. He were on an 8-fight win run, another top 10 middleweight, before losing the titles and then failing to regain them against Jermaine Taylor. But Hopkins, for the time, a lot of people have to realize, not only was he the first fighter to win 4 belts to become undisputed, he was also pretty much the number 1 rated middleweight in world from 1996 until 2004. You're looking at a near 8-year period when he was the number 1 middleweight in the world. Another thing I want to point out about Hopkins, talking about middleweight, is his fantastic record against fighters who were accomplished. Hopkins' middleweight opponents alone, okay, this is Hopkins' middleweight opponents alone, were a total of 39 world titles. Okay, his middleweight opponents at title level had a combined record of 942 fights. Okay, sorry, 764 fights. They only lost 51. his opponents in middleweight title fights had a 93% win rate. And in middleweight title fights, he also beat 4 multi-weight champions. Jackson, a 2-weight champion. Brown, a 2-weight champion. Trinidad, an unbeaten 3-weight champion. And De La Hoya, a 6-weight champion. So when you add all these things together and add that he also captured multiple middleweight titles, he was lineal middleweight champion 2001 to 2005. He was also pound for pound rated, okay, top 3 for 4 years, okay, around that time as well. He was pound for pound number 1 for 2 years. You're pretty much looking at a fighter who then went on to set even more records of most middleweight world title fights among established titles, most middleweight title defenses, to add to the first time 4-belt middleweight champion, undisputed champion in boxing history. And then what he went on to do, becoming the oldest fighter to title and then defend and unify titles at light heavyweight, you know, being a champion till he was near 50 years old. You know, that to me adds to everything. And I think Hopkins gets bad press. But, you know, when you actually look at what he did, many historical precedents he set, he fully deserves in my book to be a top 10 middleweight, which is why I have him at number 6.
Yeah, that's righteous. What a great fighter. And started late in boxing, something that is celebrated about other fighters like, say, Marciano, where they say he started late. But Hopkins really started late, and he fought past when he hit middle age. I mean, it's just pretty incredible what he was able to do. And people were writing him off for many years after his middleweight career. People were writing him off for years and years and years, where he stayed up at the world-class level. Just a brilliant fighter, a real style spoiler too, knew all the tricks. I feel like he would have done well in the old school era. He would have been one of the guys who could match these guys with taking liberties, so to speak.
Mm.
So Scrap,
yeah.
I believe we've reached your number 6, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I mention that, I just want to elaborate on one more point with Jeff Smith. BL broke down Mike Gibbons' career wonderfully, and that just elaborates on why I feel Jeff Smith should be in there, because of the career of Mike Gibbons, the career of George Chick, the career of Gene Tunney, all of these great fighters that he fought. So I just wanted to mention that. But my number 6 is Emil Griffith. Emil Ifonso Griffith. He was born February 3rd, 1938, and he died July 23rd, 2013. He was 75 years of age at the time of his passing, and he stood 5 foot 6 inches. 5 feet 6 inches is what they have on record. Weighed 160 pounds. He was a 2-time middleweight champion, 1-time junior middleweight champion, and a 3-time welterweight champion. His biggest claim to fame is when he knocked out Benny Kipperett, March 24th, 1962, 12 rounds. And Benny Kipperett didn't make it. He passed, I think, about 2 days or so. And it's unfortunate. But as welterweight, he was outstanding. As middleweight, he was in there with the greatest of the greats, with Jorge Fernandez, Emmanuel Gomez, Ruben Hurricane Carter, although he stopped in 1 round, but he was in there with him. He was in there with Carlos Monzon, and he defeated Don Jordan for the vacant WBA Junior Middleweight Championship crown. Emil Griffith was an outstanding fighter. I think he's very underrated. And I think number 6 is a proper place for him because, like I said, the middleweights are so rich in history, there's so many of them. And I wanted to make sure that he was fairly treated in terms of conversation, so I had to get him in there. I have him ranked number 6 in my all-time middleweight championship ranking list.
I'm sorry, Scrap. Forgive my casualdom. Who was the fighter?
It was Emil Griffith.
Okay, I thought so, but I didn't want to throw his graphic up until I was sure. All these names, I'm not very good with names, unfortunately. So when you start rattling the names, it's narrowing down. But I was too slow.
No, I apologize.
Could I throw some credit Scrapbook's way? Because I had a major headache doing my list, and the fact that Scrapbook has got 2 names that I love, Emil Griffith and Jeff Smith, in his list and showcasing them. Great job, buddy. Appreciate that, because I wanted him in my list. I just couldn't fit them in.
And I thank you for the Mike Gibbons, because I couldn't get him on mine. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, between all of us, we're managing to get to more than 10 athletes, which is a great thing. I mean, there's so much to celebrate. Even if it was a top 50, I mean, there's so many great fighters who spent time in middleweights. What a rich history it is. So the competition is really high, and with a subjective criteria without us setting any boundaries, certainly we weren't going to have identical lists.
Griffith beating Dick Tiger more than once and beating Benvenuti in a trilogy. He lost a trilogy, but he's still beating Nino Benvenuti, a multiple-time undisputed champion himself. These are great names that Emil Griffith beat. And, you know, losing to Monzon, but then giving Monzon a tougher fight in the second fight. And, you know, Griffith as well, another point about him is that he was one of those great fighters like Hazard Charles who fought well past his prime at middleweight and could still beat many top contenders. He picked up more losses than what he would have done. But even past his prime, he was still able to beat legit top 5 middleweights. It's insane. It's crazy what, you know, some of these fighters did. So it's great that they're all getting shouted out. And hopefully people who don't know about them will learn about them. Griffith, people know, follow my channel, Hardline Boxing Talk. I'm a massive Emil Griffith fan. I have him legit top 5 at welterweight all time. I couldn't put him on this list. He was in contention, but you know, yeah, great fighter all round.
Absolutely. Does that bring us to my number 6? Is that where we are?
Yes, it does.
Okay, yeah, I struggled a lot. Griffith and Homan Williams, some of these guys, it just came down to like, okay, how was I feeling that day? I had initially made 3 different lists. I wasn't happy with any of them, but I went with the last list that I had made. I was probably in this, you know, just to, because I could debate this endlessly. And I'm sure after I'm going to make a new list after our discussion, which will probably be different than any of those 3. But for my number 6, I actually went with Jake LaMotta, who you spent some time talking about his great career, BL. I didn't know as much about him as others, but when I started to go through and look at his victim list, you know, because he's maybe most known for losing to Ray Robinson, for beating Ray Robinson in that stretch where no one else could, but also for his losses to Ray Robinson. But this guy fought a pile of excellent fighters. And if I'm not mistaken, his victim list includes California Jackie Wilson, Ray Robinson, Fritzy Zivich, Homan Williams, Bob Satterfield, Tony Gennaro. Yeah, that's right. And Villeman and Marcel Sedan and Joey DeJohn and just a pile of quality people. And he was someone who could overcome adversity. Like a loss didn't break him. Sometimes we see, I don't want to pile on anybody, but say like Deontay Wilder, when he finally lost, he seems like he took it pretty hard. He didn't just, and some of these guys from this era, and Lamotta was really as tough as they come. Like he didn't let a loss just like break him. He just came right back in there like many greats. It didn't set him back, and he was capable of some phenomenal wins and showed that throughout his career. So I had to give him a number 6, although honestly he could, like my 6 through 10 could have been in almost any order. Probably had 5 other guys arguing for that at least. Just such a crazy weight class. But yeah, Jake LaMotta, what an excellent fighter. Signature win would probably be considered Ray Robinson, but you know, Serdan and some of these others are just phenomenal victories themselves. What a great fighter he was.
Yeah, if I may add, he also fought and beat fighters. He knocked out Laurent Dothiel in 15th round. Laurent Dothiel, he was top 3 middleweight at the time. This were prior to Lamotta losing to Robinson in his next fight, who were 120 win, 1 loss, 2 draw with 78 KOs. He knocked out Laurent Dothiel. He beat tough contender Tabirio Mitri. He were on a 14-fight unbeaten run. He had only 1 defeat in over 50 fights. He'd also knocked out Marcel Sedan, the powerful French hooker. He'd also, you know, fought a lot of good fights. He knocked out Bob Satterfield. He actually fought Homan Williams, the great Homan Williams, and beat him. He had a 4-fight run with Fritzy Zivich, losing 1 of them and winning 3, and even beating other good contenders, tough fighters like Coley Welsh, you know, Tommy Uroz. Tommy Uroz only had 4 defeats in over 70 fights. He were a decent contender as well. When you look at his overall resume of who he's fought, you know, he got stopped, of course, by Billy Fox, the light heavyweight puncher. He were 42-1 with 42 knockouts. He were 4th rated at light heavyweight. You know, he were a major puncher. But, you know, when you look at his career is insane. And I've been saying for a lot of years that fighters like Lamotta and Gene Fullmer are almost criminally underrated as fighters, you know, for the amount of fighters they fought and beat. You know, top contenders they fought and beat. I mean, to give people an idea, Lamotta fought top 3 fighters at, you know, welterweight, middleweight, and light heavyweight. He fought multiple top 3 fighters across 3 weight divisions. Incredible, tough fighter, incredible resume. Yeah, sorry, random, I'm babbling on, but Yeah. Certainly goes underrated.
You guys can elaborate as much as you want. That's what we're here for, and that's what people in the chat and listening with us and also after the fact are looking for. They're looking for us to go off on some of these people, and I'm leaving it up to you guys to do a lot of the going off, because I'm still, I've kind of specialized in the early 1900s, so a lot of this I've had to really study for this one. I still feel thoroughly inadequate, but what a great conversation for me to be part of. Like, I'm sitting here.
Also, may I say,
yeah,
that he is one of the toughest middleweight fighters of all time, with a chin up there, to me, close to Hagler, in terms of rock solid guy to try and get rid of. Yeah, he was stopped by, Fox, who were a big puncher. He would also stop by Danny Nardico, a fellow decent puncher at light heavyweight later on. Danny Nardico were a good puncher himself. So, but he was a tough fighter, and he could slip and cross arm blocking the shots much better than people give him credit for. People say, well, his hands are low, he's just getting punched up. No, he wasn't like that at all. And another good reason why you're dealing with a great fighter, I've said it before, I'm sure Scrapbook will get me on this. Some great fighters like Floyd Mayweather, he outboxes people. His boxing skills are too good for his opponents. But when you're fighting and beating California Jack Wilson, Homan Williams, Basara, Zivic, all these other fighters, Sedan, he couldn't rely on boxing skill. He had to rely on durability and stamina and sheer bloody-minded toughness to win. He couldn't rely on a big knockout punch. He couldn't rely on having the skill sets to outbox these dangerous fighters. He had to go in and offset their skills and overpower them, overwork them, start to break them down. And I think he doesn't get respected enough for that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I got to thank you you did a great live stream comparing the great Marvin Hagler to other great middleweights. I think 6 or 7 of the great middleweights, and Lamotta was one of the guys you brought up. And yeah, that resume is something special, even amongst all these special resumes. So I was happy to give him a shout, even though there are a bunch of guys who could argue for that lower part of the top 10, like dozens of guys realistically who did great things, enough to be at least in consideration.
If I may, before I forget, I'll let Scrap jump in there because I'm babbling on. I apologize, Scrap. But another thing I really want to point out for Jake LaMotta that he doesn't get the credit for is, in that time, he fought a whole number of fighters from one bunch of fighters who many fighters didn't want to fight. It wasn't only that he fought Homan Williams, he also beat Burley Tell, the fantastic southpaw fighter. So, he also fought the Black Murderers Row fighters, a number of them, a number of times, and at that time when Black Murderers Row fighters were getting frozen out of a lot of fights, he was willing to step in ring with them, as well as stepping in ring with many people's #1 greatest fighter of all time. So I'll stop babbling now. I'll let Scrapbook jump in. My apologies, Scrap. I'm hogging the airways.
Not at all. Thank you. No, anything that you contribute is very important, because we're talking about fighters who we all respect and admire, and obviously deserve to be on a specific list. I don't have much to say now about Jake LaMotta because he's actually my next conversation piece. I have him ranked number 5. If I can just go ahead and get that over with, or BL wants to do his number 5.
Yeah, BL, go ahead and do your number 5. But yeah, LaMotta definitely worth a very high rating, even looking all time. Yeah, BL, we're down to your top.
I'm very impressed that you've, before I name your number 5, I'm very impressed, Random, that you've had a look at these things and seen the state of his career and ranked him in your top 10. I think it's good credit to him because he goes very underrated. My number 5 is actually a fighter who I would have loved to have seen fight LaMotta, and that is Stanley Ketchel. Now, he's already appeared on Random's list, okay, but to me, Stanley Ketchel, the Michigan Assassin, didn't have the largest middleweight resume, but talking about him as a middleweight fighter, I think you were looking at one of the toughest middleweight fighters of all time. Very durable, could fight big guys, could knock out big guys, could knock out, big guys with his punch power. All starting from that fighting outside casinos where someone comes, pays $20 to fight this spindly looking kid in this makeshift ring outside casino. You can be weighing 16 stone. You get in ring with this little 8-9 stone teenager, and that teenager will fight you toe to toe. Okay, and if you can batter him, knock him out, he might knock you out. And he knocked out his fair share of big guys outside that casino. But that built in Stanley Ketchel a lack of fear in fighting bigger men. You know, when he went into trilogy with Joe Thomas before he destroyed Mike Twin Sullivan in one round, okay, to become middleweight champion, recognized as middleweight champion. He fought a trilogy against a fighter called Joe Thomas. Now, Joe Thomas is not a great fighter, but Joe Thomas's style meshed well with Stanley Ketchel, and they produced 3 epic battles. The first one was a 20-round draw. Their second fight, Ketchel won by 32nd round knockout after nearly being knocked out in round 26 or 27 himself. You know, Ketchel could maintain punch power for 30+ rounds. He knocked out Joe Thomas. And then the third fight, he won on points over 20 rounds. He fought 72 rounds against tough Joe Thomas in 3 fights. He then destroys Mike Twin Sullivan in 1 round. And then, you know, to add insult to injury to the Sullivan family, he then knocks out Jack Twin Sullivan, you know, his brother. He then beats Billy Papke, okay, beats Billy Papke. Then he knocks out Hugo Kelly, one of the top middleweight contenders at the time, destroys Hugo Kelly inside 3 rounds, and then goes into the second fight, okay, with Billy Papke, who he's already beaten on 1 occasion when he made his second middleweight title defense. But he goes in with Billy Papke, loses, okay, the middleweight title, and then Ketchel becomes the first fighter in boxing history to regain the middleweight title, a record that would stand until Sugar Ray Robinson became a 3-time middleweight champion. Robinson equaled Ketchel's record when he beat Randy Turpin in the rematch after, you know, losing the title in that shock upset to Turpin. But for those decades before that, Ketchel ruled supreme as the only 2-time undisputed middleweight champion at world. He also beat fighters like Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, beating him on points 1 time, destroying him inside 3 rounds the next time. You know, he won the Papke trilogy 3-1. Okay, he lost the 1 fight to Papke. He'd already beaten him. He went on to beat 2 more. And then, you know, even fighting Porky Dan Flynn, fighting Willie Lewis, fighting Jack Johnson himself, the heavyweight champion, you know, fighting Frank Klaus, fighting the great Sam Langford himself. To me, Ketchel was one of the best pound-for-pound middleweight punchers of all time. He had a great chin. He had high energy, was durable. He could fight a lot of rounds. Quite a high work rate. He was very good at grappling and sapping energy. He was just, combined with his power, as well as being first 2-time middleweight champion, I think he's one of the most impressive middleweight fighters. And I would have loved to have seen him not get shot, you know, over the nefarious goings on, with that famous last quote, "I'm cold, take me on to my mother," or "take me on to mummy," he said, because he were obviously suffering severe blood loss. You go cold not long before you pass. But I would have loved for him to be in around next 5 years to fight George Chipp, Frank Klaus again, Mike Gibbons, Harry Greb. What could have been, who knows, we will never know. But one thing we do know for sure is he's one of the great middleweight champions and one of the most ferocious, hard-punching middleweight champions of all time.
Absolutely. What a great tribute. So I believe, Scrapbook, we've arrived at your number 5 selection.
A great tribute, BL. Great tribute to Stanley Ketchel.
Thank you, Scrap.
Yes, my number 5 is Random's number 6. Great middleweight. And that is the Raging Bull, Jacob Lamotta. The man who stood 5 foot 8 inches, had a 67-inch reach. He was born July 10th, 1922, and he died September 19th, 2017. He was 95 years of age at the time of his death. The conversations I had with Jake LaMotta are unbelievable. This man was something else. Had 106 total bouts, 83 wins, 30 knockouts, 19 losses. He's part of the 19-loss middleweight championship club. Ray Robinson had 19 losses. I ran the Blade Barkley, Dick Tiger, Jake LaMotta. You had a man by the name, in fact, he was from Philadelphia. His name was Gil Turner. Now, he was a welterweight, but he did move up to the middleweight division at one time. Joey Giardello, you had Mickey Walker. A lot of great middleweights who were champions had 19 losses, so that's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, here's the thing with Jake LaMotta. March 3rd, 1941 to April 14th, 1952 was his career record. That's the years that he fought. His first amateur bout was recorded October 21st, 1940. But guess who turned professional? That was his amateur. Guess who turned professional October 4th, 1940? And that was Ray Robinson. And what's so interesting about that, Jake LaMotta turned amateur in 1940 in October, and Ray Robinson turned professional in October of 1940. And he had a lot of amateur fights with Ray Robinson, but they would meet each other 6 separate occasions. Now, Jake had knocked out Marcel Cerdan, who was a middleweight champion June 16, 1949 in Detroit, Michigan. What was interesting about that was Jake LaMotta was always trying to get away, a middleweight championship shot, but he was avoided by many fighters, Tony Zell specifically. So the mob had offered him a deal because his brother Joe LaMotta had owed them some money. If you take a dive, we'll make sure you get a title shot. That happened in 47 in New York's Madison Square Garden when he was in the ring with Blackjack Billy Fox, who was from Philadelphia. So he finally gets his opportunity. It turns out that Marcel Sedan didn't answer the 10th round. Now, Jake LaMotta had hit Marcel Sedan, the body and the shoulders and the chest cavity, kept breaking him down. And Marcel Sedan could not answer. He didn't get off his stool. For the 10th round, he said that he injured his shoulder and he couldn't continue. February 14th, 1951, LaMotta stopped Ray Robinson. He was stopped by Ray Robinson in 13 rounds. Ray Robinson was a hell of a puncher. He already faced Jake LaMotta 5 times before that. That was his 6th and final time, and he gave him a beating. And the one thing that Jake LaMotta always taken pride in is that he was never knocked down. And he walked over to Ray Robinson and said, "You didn't get me down." This was after the fight was over. When they show the movie, they show it during the course of the end round. Didn't happen until after the fight was over, sometime in the locker room, and he told him, "You didn't get me down, Ray." September 13th, 1950, LaMotta stops Frenchman's Lorenzo Thiel. Now, BL had mentioned that. The thing with Lorenzo Thiel, he had already defeated LaMotta February 21st, 1949, 10-round decision. This was in Quebec, Canada, or Montreal. He had Jake LaMotta's number, but Jake LaMotta had fooled him, and he acted like he couldn't, he was slow in the ring, and he couldn't hit him, and he baited him in. And it took 13 seconds before that fight was over before he got him out of it. And I thought that was very brilliant of Jake LaMotta, because Jake LaMotta couldn't handle a man with fast feet, which Lorenzo Thiel had. And that was his downfall when it came to Ray Robinson. He had faced Norman Hayes and Irish Bob Murphy. He was knocked out for the first time in 7 rounds with Danny Nardico. Now, Danny Nardico had a vicious war with heavyweight. His name was Charlie Norcus. It was one of the fights of the year. They fought twice, but that was one of the greatest fights that you would ever see, Charlie Norcus and Danny Nardico. So it was no crime to lose to Danny Nardico, let alone get knocked out by him. April 4th, 1954, he faced Billy Couray, and that was his last fight in Miami Beach. But he fought fighters such as Homan Williams and Marcel Sedan, Cecil Hudson and Tommy Bell, Detroit's O'Neill Bell, Pittsburgh's Ozzie Bulldog Harris, Jose Basora, Lorenzo Strickland, in 6 rounds in New York's Madison Square Garden, Fritzy Zivit 4 times, California Jackie Wilson, Anton Radic, Johnny DeJohn. He was in there with Tiberio Mitri, who, by the way, Tiberio Mitri had knocked out a fighter who, in my opinion, is very underrated, and that's Randy Turpin. Knocked him out in 1 round. He was in there with Burt Littell and Lloyd Marshall. So in my opinion, Jake LaMotta was a very underrated, but yet he was a fantastic middleweight. And one other thing, when he was an amateur, he won the light heavyweight championship diamond belt. When Ray Robinson was an amateur, he won the bantamweight. It was the bantamweight Metropolitan AAU championship in 1938. So I thought that was very interesting. So Jake LaMotta, great fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly a man worth celebrating, and is maybe more remembered for who he lost to as well as who he won to. But, not every resume is remembered the same way. But fortunately, with hindsight, we can just sort of put these careers in perspective. And what a great career he had. Maybe if Ray Robinson didn't exist, he would be seen a lot differently. He just happens, sometimes people are in an era with even greater fighters, and so they're not going to get the win-loss that other fighters would get in maybe a thinner era. That was partly why I had him as high as I had him over some other great fighters.
I'm sorry, man. Just one last thing. It's interesting that you say that, because I think that's why he is as popular today as he is, because of Ray Robinson, because of the wars that he had with him. But you're right. Perhaps if Ray Robinson didn't exist, things would have been different. But it's because of Ray Robinson why he's so popular.
That's true. That's also very true. Yeah, as far as with casuals who know his name and know the story and his toughness and resilience. Yeah, great fighter. Really nice to see him on the list. So I've kind of lost track. Where are we at? Are we at your number 5 BL or number
That was
4?
my 5.
So what are we at? My number 5?
You're at your number 5.
Okay, so I really struggle with the number 5 pick. The top 3 I sort of haggled out with myself, but number 4 and 5 I was really struggling, even to this very moment now as I'm stalling before I have to make a decision. I think let me find my graphic here. I think for my number 5, I'm gonna go with Escopeta, Carlos Monzon. Just an incredible middleweight destroying machine, and someone who, after some early setbacks, had complete success or was undefeated for just an enormous run. Like with Gene Tunney had the one loss to Greb, but he had a lot of experience when he got that loss. Monzon's, the texture of his career is a little different, but he was dominant. He was the man. And, we're judging greatness in combat sports, not state of mind. So he was kind of crazy. Maybe that helped him in the ring, but certainly what he did in competition was just, intensely impressive. So I gave him number 5. It was close. It was going to be 4 or 5 because he did great things. And talk about consistency, BL, and prolonged success. Well, this is a guy who exemplified it and isn't remembered by hardcores. He's remembered, but by maybe casual fans, he would be distasteful to think of because of the rest of his life and how his life ended. But yeah, certainly a great fighter, just strictly in sporting terms. And so he made my number 5. And I believe that takes us to your number 4.
I was just going to say, sorry, I've got tongue-tied. Right, refocus. Yeah, Scrapbook, great breakdown on Lamotta. Random, that's an interesting pick for number 5, Monzon. I'm going to go to my number 4 now, though. My number 4, and this has been a great live stream, and it's great because we don't have them all the same. We look at fighters a little bit differently, and we have different lists, and I think that's a real privilege of a live stream like this. You get to hear people's different opinions on things. Sometimes I babble so much on my channel, I only hear myself half the time. So it's always good to hear other people's opinions, how they break things down. So thank you to both of you for that. It's why I really enjoy doing these. Now, my number 4. Now, I've got to be honest. My number 4 are fairly set, but I keep swapping number 1 and number 2, and I keep swapping number 3 and number 4. Okay, and the headache I've had has gone on for many, many years since I came on YouTube, and it's gone on many years before I came on YouTube. My number 4, I'm going to put Marvelous Mavin Hagler. I'm going to put Marvelous Mavin Hagler as number 4. To me, Hagler was one of the toughest middleweight fighters of all time. He's one of the pound-for-pound big punching middleweight champions of all time. He's one of the longest reigning lineal middleweight champions of all time. Of course, he owned in his career all 3 belts, originally having WBC, WBA, then he gained the IBF as well, when the IBF came in the early to mid 1980s. So basically, Hagler was the dominant king right from the early times when he actually fought and beat Alan Minter, destroyed Alan Minter. One of the most brutish showings of force you can see. The way Hagler, because a lot of people have this perception of Hagler that he has slow hands. No, you're talking that's the Hagler who fought, Tommy Earns and John McGarvey. He had slower hands, but in his earlier career, he was actually a very fluid puncher and could put his punches together really, really well. He dismantled Alan Minter. There was a nasty racist environment around that fight. Some people have built up this racial tirade against Hagler, and there were ugly scenes. And frankly, witnessing those scenes of Hagler being pelted by bottles and all kinds of horrible things was an outrageous scene that should never be seen in a boxing ring, or any sports, or in life in general. Outraged by that treatment he received. But he destroyed and dissected Minter, split his face open in multiple parts. We're hitting him with left hooks, right hooks, uppercuts, continuous punches. Minter was just outclassed. He then goes in with Fulgencio Obalmejias, who would go on to be a super middleweight strap holder, I believe WBA super middleweight champion. He was 30-0 with 27 KOs when Hagler beat him. He were rated 7th at middleweight. He then destroyed Antifermo much easier in the rematch to get his rightful revenge. Then beat Mustafa Ramshaw. He were on a 27-fight unbeaten run. He only had 1 defeat in 35 fights. He were rated 3rd in world at middleweight. And, you know, this is something Hagler don't get credit for. Many fighters he fought in his middleweight reign were actually the top 10 rated middleweights. I'll touch on that in a second. He beat, you know, Hamshaw twice. He beat Tommy Hearns in one of the greatest middleweight title fights of all time. Hearns was the lineal light middleweight champion, and he'd been the WBA welterweight champion who took part in that legendary welterweight battle for undisputed with Sugar Ray Leonard. He'd also destroyed Roberto Duran in 2 rounds, who took Hagler 15 rounds, and he beaten Wilfred Benitez. So, you know, Hearns, a 2-weight champion and the current lineal light middleweight champion, jumping up and having that war, Hagler coming through it. He could be a notoriously slow starter, which to me cost him the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. Leonard pulled away too far over the first 4 or 5 rounds. But Hagler could be a notorious slow starter like Charlie Burley. But he came out in Hearns' fight. He'd warmed up extra long in dressing room, so he was nice and warmed up when he came to ring ready for, as he called it, a war. He then absorbed incredible punches off unbeaten 25-0, 25 KO John the Beast Mugabe, who was top 5 rated at light middleweight, a former brief light middleweight champion himself, who, despite what people think, he did fight a whole number of top 10 rated light middleweights. John Mugabe, people make out he didn't fight any rated fighters, but actually he did when you investigate it. And Hagler ruled the division. Until losing Sugar Ray Leonard, he was the dominant king of the division, with great battles in there against Sugar Ray Leonard, the tough and hard fight against Mugabe. Mugabe hit Hagler with some outrageous shots, and Hagler showed that toughness and durability to absorb those punches, started to break Mugabe down in middle rounds, and eventually stopped him. The great war with Tommy Hearns, the tough and close fight with Roberto Duran, who at that point was rated top 3 in world at light middleweight, the wins over Simpson and Scipione, the destruction of Antifermo in rematch, beating Obel Mayas when he was 30-0, then beating Obel Mayas again when he'd gone on a further 8-fight unbeaten run, okay, and he was still top 10 rated at middleweight. So to me, marvelous Marvin Hagler beating you know, Minter top 3, beating Obel Mayas top 10, you know, beating Hamshaw top 3, beating Obel Mayas and Simpson top 10, beating Roberto Duran top 3 at light middle, beating Hamshaw top 10 at middle. He's fighting rated fighters, and he's pretty much the king of the division, one of the long reigning lineal champions. I put Hagler number 4.
Oh, that's excellent. What a great tribute.
God, I'm wittering tonight, guys. Sorry, I've got my mojo. My mojo's in full flow.
This is wonderful. I've been greatly anticipating this. This is a real treat for me, and I'm sure for a lot of the listeners, this is the good stuff. This is where you get to hear people rant instead of, you know, because there are more formulaic ways to present the information for general audience. But this is, I think, for maybe more of the hardcores. I'm very recently become what you might call, like, at least for the history of it, hardcore. So I'm learning a lot all the time. I appreciate your guys' time, and everyone listening. Thank you for your time. Also, you know, there's lots of stuff to do on the internet. Thank you for spending some time with us. Now, Scrapbook, I believe we've reached your number 4, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. That is correct. I'm going to take a little time to explain this particular fighter because he's well deserving. He's sandwiched in with these greats. But I believe he belongs on here, especially after the Hall of Fame that just took place a week ago that I had a pleasure of being at. Roy Jones Jr., Captain Hook. I'm going to explain why I believe he needs to be not only on his list, but where he's placed in number 4. Here's a man who was 5'11". He was a junior middleweight when he turned professional. He went as high as heavyweight. Let me break this down for you. He was a gold medalist in 1984 as a bantamweight. All right? This is in the National Junior Olympics. In 1988, 4 years later, he would participate in the Seoul Olympic Games, and he'd be ripped off for his gold medal. He would have to settle for a silver medal. As I said, he turned professional as a junior middleweight. He had a record of 75 total bouts, 66 wins, 47 knockouts. He was stopped a few times. That's because he was trying to reach greatness. Now, May 22nd, 1993, he defeated Bernard the Executioner Hopkins for the vacant IBF Middleweight Championship belt. Why was this important? James Toney relinquished that title. James Toney had knocked out Michael second to none. Michael second to none was the middleweight. He was an alternate in the 1984 Olympic Games. He defeated Frank Tate in the amateurs at least 2 out of 3 times, I'll say. But Frank Tate was the Olympic gold medalist in 1984. Michael Nunn had knocked out Frank Tate for that title. James Toney knocked out Michael Nunn for the crown. That's what makes it significant. When Roy Jones had defeated, this man here that we're talking about, James Toney, that was very important to me. He also took out a fighter who I think is belongs in the Hall of Fame, and he's in there now. And that's why this fighter is not in the Hall of Fame, James Lights Out Toney. In my opinion, he's not on this list because the fact that since he made it to the Hall of Fame, he only enhanced Roy Jones's legacy even more. So he did himself harm on this list by making it to the Hall of Fame, because now that he's in the Hall of Fame, which Roy Jones is already in, it makes Roy Jones, it solidifies his record. You know what I mean? So that's why it hurt James Lights Out Toney. That's why he's not on my top 10. Roy Jones is. I'm sorry I confused you. November 18th, 1994, he beat James Lights Out Toney for the Super Middleweight Championship title, and they called the Silver War. And it wasn't until James Toney decided to do the chicken dance, because Roy Jones did the chicken dance, and James Toney tried to emulate him, and he got caught with a hook. So it just shows you the mindset, the IQ of Roy Jones. He raises chickens, he knows how they operate, and he was able to employ that on James Toney, because James Toney was a head guy. He's the kind of guy that you get him mad, he's going to try and knock you out, and he was able to drop him. Knocked out Vinny Panzienza, who was a one-time lightweight champion, Tony Thornton, Murky Sosa, Frankie Little. I was in the second row watching all of these kind of fights. Light heavyweight championship, he defeated Mike McCallum, November 1996. He lost Monto Griffin in 97, but he would redeem himself. March 21st, 2009, he stopped Omar Shika, and he won the WBO and the NABO light heavyweight championship crown. Here's a man who had 7 titles simultaneously. Roy Jones, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated fighters. Man goes up to fight John Ruiz for the heavyweight championship crown, and he beats him. It's the fact that he lost 25 pounds of weight, I believe, contributed to the knockout of Tarver. But you can't undermine Roy Jones. So I have to have him on this list. And number 4, the last slot that I can possibly put him in. So that's why I rank him. Number 4 is the best middleweight, at least in modern time.
Oh, that was a great tribute. What a great tribute. Yeah, great fighter. There were so many fighters where I felt bad they weren't on the list, and I was almost wishing we'd done 20 before I realized it would mean we would talk for 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah.
In fact, if we did a top 11 or 12, it would probably take an extra 30 minutes. Get exponentially worse the more factors, because you have to mention some of the guys in contention for those lower slots, lower top 10, 15 slots. But yeah, Roy Jones Jr., what a fighter. So if I'm not mistaken, this brings me to my number 4, is it?
Yeah, correct.
That's correct.
Okay, so I don't have to say too much about my number 4, because BL did such a great job. My number 4 middleweight of all time, marvelous Marvin Hagler. What a great fighter he was. Checked so many different boxes. He was the man. And he, unlike some of the other middleweights, he didn't pass through middleweight. Like, he was the guy. He sat in that division fantastically well. Just like, although a lesser career, but like Joe Calzaghe, the Welsh super middleweight, who spent almost his entire career just in the one weight class, just beating up all the people he could get to fight. But Hagler did it in a richer, deeper, more historic weight class. And that's why I struggled between him and Monzon, but I think Hagler's signature wins edge it to him. I don't know if that's fair or not. That might just be my ignorance, my being kind of casual in some ways. But yeah, I had to give Marvelous Marvin that slot. So that brings us to number 3, I believe. And BL, is it your number 3 right now?
Yes, it is. Yes. Now, my number 3, okay, is a fighter you've just mentioned, okay, and I will go through the reasons why. At times I put Hagler number 3. At times I put this fighter number 3. At the moment, he's my number 3. Him and Hagler continually fight and swap for the number 3 place. But the great Carlos Monzon, the great Argentinian champion, a fighter I rate as the greatest Argentinian fighter of all time, bar none, is my number 3. Now, I want people to picture, okay, 1964, fighting a fighter called Alberto Massi. That was Carlos Monzon's 3rd defeat, okay, in his first 19 professional fights. He went on to have a 99 fight career. Do you know how many more he lost? 0. Okay, from 1964, Monzon went unbeaten until he left the sport in 1977. Okay, he went a near 13-year unbeaten run. Now, having an unbeaten run for 13 years is impressive enough, but also that means he's fully unbeaten in title fights. He's fully unbeaten against the Hall of Fame names he fought. He's unbeaten against the champions he fought. He's unbeaten against all the top 10 rated fighters that he fought. Monzon went on to build a record of 87-3-9 with 59 KOs. And like I said, an 80-fight unbeaten run over 13 years, including being unbeaten in 15 world title fights with 10 KOs, being undefeated in 12 undisputed title fights, included in that, with 7 KOs. Another thing about Monzon is he gave up 1 belt, you know, with the Napoli situation, re-won it against Rodrigo Valdez. So in 1 title reign of unbeaten 15 title fights, he was actually a 2-time undisputed middleweight champion without ever having lost a belt in the ring. Now, that all of that's impressive enough. He was also the number 1 rated fighter in the world from middleweight in the world from 1970 to 1976. For those near 7 years, he was the imperious middleweight champion in the ratings. He was pretty much unanimous rated. He also fought a lot of good fighters in his career. You know, he fought fighters like Jose Fernandez. He had 7 defeats in 120 fights. He was a tough, reliable contender who could give pretty much most fighters very good fights. It wasn't really, you know, not counting fighters like Eddie Pace, another good fighter, but really in his title reign, Monzon lit up. He defeated the great Nino Benvenuti, okay, who had 6 defeats in near 90 fights, was on a small win run to become world champion. His next title defense was actually the rematch against Nino Benvenuti, okay, when he made the first defense at undisputed title. He then destroyed Benvenuti in 3 rounds. He then went straight in, okay, to fight a top 3 middleweight in world at the time, past his prime, but still top 3 middleweight in world, the great Emil Griffith, who was on a 10-fight win run. Monzon stopped him, okay, in the 14th round to gain a big win there. And then he fought in his 3rd defense, Denny Moyer, another fighter who was on an 11-fight unbeaten run. He was a veteran of over 100 fights. Monzon stopped him. He also, in his title record, stopped top middleweight contenders like Jean-Claude Boutier twice. One time Boutier was 5th in world, the next time he was 6th in world. He also beat 8th rated middleweight in world Benny Briscoe. He also beat other top 10 rated middleweights like Mundine, Licata, and Gratian Toner. Toner were top 3 rated. Mundine and Licata were top 10 rated. He also then became undisputed champion for a 2nd time against a fighter who was on a 27-fight unbeaten run, the very dangerous Rodrigo Valdez, who only had 4 defeats in over 60 fights. Monzon beat him when he was top 3 rated in world to become a 2-time undisputed champion in 1 reign as lineal champion. He then beat Rodrigo Valdez, who at that time was the number 1 rated middleweight contender in world, below Monzon, the ring champion. So when you add all that together with Carlos Monzon, you have got the multi-year number 1 middleweight in world who had an 80-fight unbeaten run over 13 years. And like I said, unbeaten in title fights, 2-time undisputed champion. And when you've beaten names like Briscoe and Benvenuti twice, and Emil Griffith twice, and Rodrigo Valdez twice, and good tough contenders like Boutier, Licata, Toner, the way he dismantled the great Jose Napoles. Napoles had 5 defeats and over 80 fights. He had over 50 knockouts. He also was on a win run of, I think, 12 fights. He was the top rated welterweight in the world, and like across history with Mickey Walker, many fighters, he jumped up. And Monzon systematically dismantled Jose Napoles, and it wasn't even really that difficult. You know, when you can go in a boxing ring and systematically dismantle Jose Napoles, then you are the real deal. And when you add to that his overall work, his incredible record, his incredible title fight record, unbeaten, being an unbeaten 2-time undisputed champion of the world, never losing that title in ring, you know, fantastic acclaim. That's why I put Monzon at my number 3.
What a great tribute. Yeah, what a fantastic fighter he was. I've struggled a lot. Coming into the conversation, I had Monzon 4 and Hagler 5, and then I was like, well, as I'm thinking about it throughout the talk, as it gets down to the top, what a great fighter he had, and what prolonged success. I mean, he checks that box intensely. So, Scrap, I believe we've reached your number 3 selection, sir.
Yes, now this is where I had to really think about opportunities of fighters not having what they deserve. And there's a couple of names out there, but I had to choose one for this particular slot. And I chose Charlie Burley. Why I chose Charlie Burley is for several reasons, because he was more than worthy. 1938, he would win the colored welterweight championship belt from Coco Kid. Now, Coco Kid would be the first fighter in the third wave of Black Murderers Roll to pick up that title when he defeated young Peter Jackson. This is very interesting, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit. He was the first, Coco Kid was the first colored welterweight champion and the last colored middleweight champion in 1943 when he would defeat Homan Williams. So that name, Coco Kid, is very, very important when you're judging a fighter such as Charlie Burley, because he has to have a name like that on his list. He was in the ring with Homan Williams 7 times. They split victories 3-3 and 1 no contest. Now, Coco Kid defeated Homan Williams. They fought 14 times and defeated him 9 times out of the 14. Shows you the credibility and the character and the personality, as well as the ability of Coco Kid. I keep going back to Coco Kid because he was the benchmark for this Black Murderers Row. Now, as far as Charlie Burley, he was in the ring with guys like Archie Moore and Homan Williams, Jack Chase, who he would take the California State Light Heavyweight Championship belt from. He would win the colored middleweight championship belt in 42 from Homan Williams. Charlie Burley was denied of opportunity. Does that enhances his career or enhances his resume? No, it does not. But it does explain that had he been given the opportunity, most people believe as though he would have had an opportunity to at least compete for the middleweight championship belt, let alone win it. So I have to choose Charlie Burley for number 3. That's a very, very thin line. But you're talking Charlie Doc Williams and Burt Nattell and Andrew Tiger Wade. I mean, Oakland Billy Smith. My God, the names, Ezra Charles, the names that he was in the ring with is unbelievable. There was fighters called Shorty Hughes and Big Boy Hughes. They're out of San Francisco, California. These were murderous fighters. They fought Archie Moore many times. And Charlie Burley was in the ring with them. So I have to choose Charlie Burley. I mean, he's fighting Jimmy Bivens and all of these great names. I got to put Charlie Burley in this opportunity of number 3. So I'm going with Charlie Burley. A hell of a fighter he was.
Oh, yes, absolutely. BL, do you want to add to that at all before I do my number 3?
Yeah. Charlie Burley at middleweight also, lost twice to the great Ezard Charles, which is no disgrace at all. But I think Charlie Burley is similar to my number 3, Carlos Monzon, in some ways, in that Burley was a calm and patient assassin who would ruthlessly and systematically dissect your style, pick you off, hit you with hard punches, deny you the ability to hit him with many clean punches, and would just round after round systematically destroy you, like he did Archie Moore. Like Archie Moore famously commented, it wasn't so much that Burley beat me like that, it was the fact he was out the night before having a drink. that really Archie Moore, he trained really hard for fighting, really serious, and he thought Burley hadn't, and Burley put an absolute licking on him. Burley figured out the cross-arm defense of Archie Moore and systematically slammed shots through in multiple areas where the cross-arm defense would not defend Archie Moore from Burley's punches. He had one of keen boxing minds. He had a keen boxing mind. The fight that Scrapbook alluded to, the no contest, I did severe investigation into that fight, and I read dozens of articles on that fight, and I even read the commission report on that fight afterwards, because the referee, was it the 10th round or 11th round, somewhere like that, the referee said, no, fight's over, done. Because what those two men had put on in that ring was one of the best displays of defensive boxing, that many people there were very unhappy. They wanted blood and carnage, and they wanted to see a big punch up. But what Homan Williams and Burley did, and this shows what kind of fighter Burley was, is they put on a display of, well, I'll try and hit you and see if I can hit you, and then I'll let you have a go at me. And they were both putting on a defensive masterclass against each other. And there was not enough action. They were both avoiding, slipping, weaving under shots, fantastically showcasing the defensive skill. The referee got bored and threw it out. Some of the crowd were booing, saying, oh, no, we want blood and gore. And they threw them out. And they were actually going to deny their purse. But a commission investigation decided to pay them their purses. They originally were going to get their purses suspended, because the report from referee said they just weren't trying to fight. They were making a mockery of it. But when they investigated, they rightly agreed to give him purses. But he was a fantastic talent, a natural talent in boxing, almost a prodigy. If you can dismantle Archie Moore systematically, then you are really that good of a fighter. Burley was a bit of a slow starter, like I mentioned, a bit like Hagler, which is what cost him the first Ezard Charles fight more so, and to an extent the second fight. He started a bit quicker in second fight. By round 3, we were getting going, whereas first fight, Charles shot into a lead with them wasp hornet-like multi-punch attacks where Charles shot off into a lead. Burley started faster, and second fight were closer, but he's one of boxing's great talents. He's almost a prodigy to me in boxing, a natural talent. And to see this guy have to take a part-time job as a garbage collector, okay, so he could feed his family, is an outrage, and just shows what some of these great fighters had to go through in their careers.
Absolutely. That's a great tribute right there, BL. Thank you for that.
Great, BL. Can I make one more statement?
Please.
Sorry, Scrapbook. I cut you off there, buddy.
No. Thank you so much for everything that you added to that, because that was outstanding. I do appreciate that. Random, just one more quick thing on Charlie Burley. Now, he faced Freddie Steele. He defeated him 2 out of 3 times. He was in the ring with Billy Stoos. But what really made me take a look at Charlie Burley, he was sparring with a fighter by the name of Harry Bobo. He was a heavyweight. And Harry Bobo was getting Ezard Charles prepared at that time for a specific fight. And Homan Williams was in the gymnasium watching Charlie Burley. Charlie Burley knocked out Harry Bobo. And this was an outrage, because people couldn't believe how hard this man can hit and how scientifically of a fighter he really was, because Harry Bobo was no slouch. Charlie Burley also knocked out Jersey Joe Walcott. A lot of people don't know that, in the gym as well. So he was a fierce puncher. He was most avoided because you couldn't make that kind of money with Charlie Burley, and you didn't want to lose against him, because Charlie Burley was, and this is the problem that he had in 38 with Henry Armstrong. You see, when he fought Fizzy Zivic, and I'm going to go out on a limb, but I know this by speaking to a lot of old-time historians, that when he fought Fizzy Zivic, the first time he fought Fizzy Zivic, he lost to Fizzy Zivic. Then he went and defeated him in 38 and 39 after that. But Fizzy Zivic was in line to face Henry Armstrong. And it would have put a damper on it if Charlie Burley would have defeated Fizzy Zivic. So I'm going to go as far as to leave it there. But Charlie Burley was such an underrated fighter. He was such an avoided fighter. It's just a shame that he's not more appreciated and on people's pound for pound list, because he was unbelievable. Just so many little things about Charlie Burley. A lot of people don't realize what made him a great fighter. But I just wanted to add that part to him, because Charlie Burley was a hell of a fighter. He really, really.
Oh, that's wonderful. This is so gratifying to hear you guys talk about this great man like this. So if I'm not mistaken, we've reached my number 3. We're closing out the number 3 selections. I struggled with the whole list, but this is an athlete, to just preface, mentioning him. This is the most feared fighter in the history of boxing. But unlike other feared fighters, because of his size, he was able to just fight much larger men. And he's not the only one to do it. And he's not even the only one in my top 3 to do it, to go all the way up to heavyweight. But this particular fighter hit like a heavyweight, and he moved like a lightweight or a welterweight. And the men his own size in his day, the ones who were willing to face him, he got the best of them when he was at his best, which was years. The only reason I don't have him higher is because his prime was pretty much split between walking around as a middleweight and a light heavyweight. And then later, when he was walking as a heavyweight, I think you could say he was getting past his prime. And this is the great Sam Langford, possessor of an insane amount of nicknames. Some are more savory than others, but including but not limited to Begging Sam, the Boston Tar Baby, the Boston Bone Crusher, the Black Demon from Boston, the Boston Terror. I mean, you can match Boston up with any sort of descriptive term for destruction that you have. Sam Langford, born in Canada, moved down to worked his way down to Boston, and so the BL, you can probably help me figure this out. So I think as far as him as a middleweight, in 2004 he was a ranked welterweight contender, but by 2005 he was fighting, like, 'cause I think young Peter Jackson was a middleweight by then. So
yeah, he fought young Peter Jackson for coloured middleweight title. Then he made a few defences at coloured middleweight title before campaigning more against light heavyweights.
Right, and then so as a middleweight now, 1905, he also fights and loses to the great Joe Jeanette. So he's fought his first Hall of Fame heavyweight, his first all-time great heavyweight, while he's in his first year as a proper middleweight. The year following, he avenges the loss to Jeanette. 2 weeks after that, he challenges a prime great Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant, gives up 30 pounds, gets cheered by the crowd for going 15 rounds, even though he took a hammering. And Johnson did have to use some of his vast tricks and knowledge to shut Langford down. It wasn't an easy fight for him, although he won convincingly. Never got to rematch Johnson, but Langford was at or around the middleweight limit. The last one I could find was April 1911. He was 161 pounds, which wasn't middleweight in his day, but now if we're talking about compared to the other guys in this discussion of more modern eras, 161 is pretty close to middleweight. Sam McVeigh was 201 pounds, and he made Sam McVeigh, one of the greatest knockout punchers of that era, fight on the retreat. He fought him for 20 rounds. So if we go from 1905 to April 1911 as Langford's middleweight body of work, it's absolutely astounding. I mean, he met guys from all different weights. BL, you can spit some out, but like young Peter Jackson, what's his name? John Sullivan's protege, Jim Barry. He gave Jim Barry a whole slew of losses. Al Kubiak.
He also fought Larry Temple for coloured middleweight title. He did fight, like you say, Joe Jeanette when Jeanette was newer to sport at a lower weight than his future heavyweight weight. He beat him. He also fought and beat fighters like George Gunther, who had very quick hands, if I recall. So he did beat a number of fighters. I don't personally put him in my top 10 simply because he overshadows his work at light heavyweight and heavyweight when I rate him top 10. But one thing about Sam Langford is he was a terrific middleweight fighter. Someone actually came to me once and said Hagler destroys him in 3 rounds and Hagler would intimidate him. I said, if Hagler tried intimidating Sam Langford, Langford would laugh in his face. This guy wasn't intimidated by 210-pound monsters like Sam McVeigh. There's no way Marvin Hagler's going to intimidate him, I'm very sorry to say. And Hagler's got a hell of a time trying to win that fight as well. So, he's certainly a major fighter across all the weights he fought at. And he was a fantastic middleweight. And around middleweight, or what now would be low super middle, 160 to 163 pounds, when he was pretty much campaigning as a middleweight, and even then fighting light heavyweights at that weight, Langford were an outstanding fighter, very dangerous fighter.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a wonderful poem, which I don't have loaded, but I saw a wonderful poem about, it was like 13 or 14 stanzas of the middleweights who wouldn't fight him when he was campaigning at middleweight. He did get to fight the great Stanley Catchell in a no decision bout, and it went 7 newspapers to Langford, 4 newspapers to Catchell, and I think a couple had it a draw. But there was talk that Langford was carrying Catchell to get him to get the big fight on the West Coast for big money in a
Yeah.
purpose-built stadium.
He also challenged Papke, he challenged Hugo Kelly, he challenged a whole number of middleweight fighters, he challenged Frank Klaus, he
the
challenged
Sullivan
a whole number of them.
twins. He wanted to fight the Sullivan twins in the same night. And but for me, Langford, the reason he appears so high on this list, he didn't go higher. There's two guys I hold above, was because he didn't get to fight the middleweights, but other fighters have been avoided, and then they just settled for fighting the guys they could fight at their own weight. Langford was fighting guys like Joe Jeanette, Jack Johnson. He was fighting, he didn't beat Johnson, but he did beat Jeanette. Guys like Big Sandy Ferguson, Al Kubiak, the English champion, Iron Hague. He's a middleweight, and he's striking the middleweights who would face him, like Tiger Smith, who I think was the Indian boxing champion. I think it was like the armed forces. I mean, he might have been Welsh, but I think he was in India, and he some sort of championship there. But Mike Schreck, a very experienced fighter, I think from Cincinnati, but fought out of Pittsburgh a lot. You know, Schreck was one of the middleweights who was willing to face him, and he absolutely blasted Schreck. It was stopped very quickly.
He destroyed him, and Schreck were actually a good fighter,
who has a pretty tough resume and had some good wins in there. He didn't lose all his big fights. Yeah. And he absolutely ripped through Schreck, which didn't help his chances of getting other middleweights to fight him. There were guys who were willing, but, you know, a lot of the guys that Langford came up with in, 1903 and 1904 and maybe even 1905, by 1906 and on, he beat Tony Ross at heavyweight. You know, he's a middleweight who was uniquely feared, but he was also willing to go fight above his weight. And I because we didn't have a set criteria, I weigh that very heavily, weight jumping. And it takes an awful lot of winning at that same weight for me to outweigh tougher fights. Because you could take any of these other guys on the list and have them fight Sam McVeigh, a prime Sam McVeigh who went 49 rounds before relenting to Joe Jeanette, Paris 1909. I don't think there's another guy on this list I'd favor against McVeigh or Jeanette. The guys that he was willing to fight while he was still a middleweight. So that's why he made it so high on my list. What a great fighter. Maybe I'm biased, but I couldn't put him at the top of the list because there are guys who did so much. To me, they couldn't compare. But he did edge out Monzon and Hagler, because I don't see Monzon or Hagler beating McVeigh. They might struggle with Big Sandy Ferguson. You're talking about a big heavyweight bruiser. Al Kubiak. Some of these guys were large and could really fight, could take a lot. You have to have enough power to make people respect you. Langford had unique power for his weight. And so that's why he made my list. Now I'm going to hand it to you, BL, for your number 2.
Oh, guys, my number 1 and 2 are like my number 3 and 4. But I'm going to stick with what I currently had them more recently. And this pains me to say, okay, but my number 2 is actually Hadi Greb. Now, some people may think, you haven't got him number 1. No, I don't have him number 1 for a few reasons. But okay, Hadi Greb set a defining historical achievement with a 45-0 in 1919. He set another defining achievement with one defeat in nearly 120 fights over a multi-year run, starting from prior to 1919, ending after his record year. Hadi Greb fought many great fighters, from Mike Gibbons. He fought a whole fight series with George Chipp. He fought Tiger Flowers 3 times, beat Mickey Walker, won the middleweight title. Actually made a whole number of defenses. He did have a number of title challenges at light heavyweight prior to that, but there were no decision fights, so he couldn't get the title, despite the fact he nearly had Levinsky out in one of them and would have been like heavyweight champion at world. He also fought Al McCoy, lineal middleweight champion in later 1910s, but again had him all out at sea, but couldn't just get the finish. So he could have been a middleweight champion years before, but he did eventually get the title. Fought a fairly clean fight for himself against Johnny Wilson, after waiting all this time, I ain't going to mess it up and get DQ'd. Okay, so he actually fought a cautious fight by his standards, I'll say, to completely beat Johnny Wilson. And then he gave Johnny Wilson a rematch. Then he fought Kid Norfolk, of course, and fought all those fighters, including tough fighters like Frank Moody, Ted Moore, Lou Bogash. Brian Downey was a very good middleweight fighter. His earlier fights with Jeff Smith prior to the later light heavyweight fights. Hadi Greb, to me, is a legendary fighter. I rate him higher than my number 1 middleweight all time, all divisions. I rate him higher. But I put Hadi Greb at number 2 at middleweight.
Righteous. All right, Scrapbook, it's time for the number 2.
This is going to be interesting, and I like to explain after I complete this conversation about this fighter why a certain fighter wasn't put in his place because we only have 10 guys. But I agree. Yeah, I agree with BL. I have Harry Greb number 2 as well. And what you have to understand about Harry Greb, here's a man, regardless of, everybody has their views of Harry Greb, how some say he was a dirty fighter, some say this, some say that. I don't look at fighting like that because you're in there in front of another man who's supposed to control the action. He's supposed to be able to dictate to you what you do back to him. It had nothing to do with you being dirty or not. So I don't go by that. I go by another man facing another man and what the outcome is going to be. You have 2 hands just like him. He didn't bring a weapon in the ring. All he did was bring in whatever he brought in with his 2 fists. Having said that, here's Harry Greb. He's in there with a man named Jeff Smith, Soldier Barfield, Les Darcy, Al McCoy, George Cook. He's in there with, some of the greatest fighters of all times. He faced Gene 25 times. 1922, he took his America's Light Heavyweight Championship belt away from him. Now, Gene Tunney was a media darling. He had 2 opportunities with Jack Dempsey to make a lot of money. He defeated Jack Dempsey in 26, and he defeated him in 27. Where was Harry Greb's opportunity in that outcome? Didn't get one. Harry Greb had faced everybody that you can think of. Zulu Kid, Chuck Wiggins, Lee Anderson, Jamaica Kid, Colette Turner. He was in there with Bob Moyer and Frank Montel. It's just really amazing the men this fighter was in there with. Jimmy Clabby, all of them. So when you look at Harry Greb and you look at Mike Gibbons, you look at Tommy Gibbons and the Tunnies, these names were the names back at that time. And he was in there with them. And it defeated the majority of them. 1919, the same year that Jack Dempsey would take on Jess Willard. This man had 45 unbeaten fights. So it got overshadowed because Jack Dempsey had defeated Jess Willard. But it was a big deal. You look at the names on the list of that year from this man, Harry Greb, Jeff Smith, battling Levinsky, Leo Florian Hook, Billy Misk. Soldier Jones, my goodness. How can you not understand that? So I put him number 2 because the man that I have ahead of him did more work in terms of the middleweight division in the time that he came. Harry Greb was all over the place. He was up and down because he was such a good fighter. So that's the only reason why I have him number 2. But I'm going to explain, if allowed the opportunity, at the end of our list, one man that I left out and why I left him out. But I have Harry Greb number 2 on this list.
Wonderful tribute. And so that brings me to my number 2. And I struggle with this myself. And with the decision process, because when you get down to that upper thing, it's like, okay, what are you looking for? And because we just used the term greatest, and there are already fighters I'd left out. But I think for me, and I'm not going to go too deep in because I know you guys are about to just straight up go off on this guy. But my number 2, I had Walker Smith Jr., the great Sugar Ray Robinson, who was magnificent. I don't know if he was better at welterweight or middleweight. Like certain champions of the past, like you could maybe argue that Ketchel was better as a welterweight than a middleweight. I'm not sure. Maybe even Walker. BL, you and Scrap, you guys can probably think of a lot of people who maybe were even more fierce at another weight. Like with Langford, you could say, yeah, he was scary as a middleweight, but once he was walking around as a light heavy, he was mythically good. And that would be fair to say, as far as like the weight thing. But for me, Robinson, the ability to just go on these great streaks, but also fight a furious schedule often at an extremely high level, legendary level. He's 3rd all time in Hall of Fame wins, only behind Langford and Greb, and was able to regain his momentum. Like he wasn't someone who lost and then lost a few fights, and then it's goodbye. He came back again and again and again, and proved his class against all these different styles on the road and at home. So a phenomenal fighter. That's all I'm going to say on him, because I know you guys are going to go off on him. But that was my number 2 pick, the great Sugar Ray Robinson. And pound for pound, I have him probably 3rd, behind only Langford and Harry Greb. So all round at those weights, but also at any weight, just for his size, just a phenomenal fighter, a real prodigy, like a real savant of boxing. Okay, so now I believe we finally reached our number 1 pick. BL, you may now go off.
Right, I certainly will go off, and then I'm sure Scrapbook will add even more great stuff to what I'm going to come out with. My number 1 middleweight of all time is Sugar Ray Robinson. Again, Harry Greb is a great all-time fighter, and was a great middleweight fighter, and was a great light heavyweight fighter, and was even a decent heavyweight contender, you could say. But in terms of the middleweight title picture, Robinson's achievements, to me, make him the number 1 middleweight of all time, even though he had the stretch at lightweight, then welterweight prior to that. Now, people know that Robinson won the fight against Jake LaMotta, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, by 13th round stoppage to win the middleweight title. One point I want to point out to people is that fight was famously in 1951 and was a brutish fight. Robinson put a licking on it. But 1951, one point I want to point out about Robinson as a middleweight is he'd already bet Jake LaMotta back in 1942 when LaMotta was a top 10 middleweight. He then lost to LaMotta when he was a top 3 middleweight, then beat LaMotta as a top 3 rated middleweight, then beat LaMotta again as a top 10 welter, beat LaMotta middleweight, beat him again as a top 10 middleweight. Then he bet Belois in 1949. He had 10 defeats and over 100 fights. He had over 50 knockouts. He were on an unbeaten run. He was top 10 rated middleweight. Robinson beat before he won the title. He beat top 10 rated middleweight Ray Barnes, beat top 10 rated middleweight and good fighter Robert Villamain. And Robinson was having some of these fights while he was defending his welterweight title. In non-title fights, he would be beating top 10 rated middleweights like Belois, like Ray Barnes, like Robert Villamain a few times, to the point they actually rated him top 2 at middleweight when he was the welterweight champion, because he was beating a whole number of top 10 rated middleweights. Then he beat LaMotta one last time. Beat LaMotta one latest time in 1951 to win middleweight title. And what he did from there, after having a number of non-title fights, he then fought Randy Turpin. You'd say, well, he's lost it in his first defense. He hadn't done great there. That is rated as one of the greatest upsets in boxing history. Robinson comes back to match Stanley Ketchell's long-held record of like 40 years, by being only the 2nd fighter to win the undisputed middleweight title twice. So he matches Stanley Ketchell's record. He then beats Carl Bobo Olsen, top 5 rated middleweight, Hall of Famer, former champion, outstanding fighter himself, to make a successful first defense. He then destroys Rocky Graziano with that beautiful left-right combo. The left opens him up, the right hand slots in and finishes him. Graziano were on a 15-fight unbeaten run. That was Robinson's 2nd middleweight title defense. And then after failing against Maxim for light heavyweight strap, trying to emulate one of his idols, Henry Armstrong, to become a 3-weight undisputed champion, he kind of left the sport a bit, came back, and then we have to go to Bobo Olsen again. This is in 1955. Now, Bobo Olsen is still on an unbeaten run, a win run, sorry. He's still top 3 rated at middleweight. Robinson destroys him to become the first 3-time undisputed lineal middleweight champion in boxing history. Finally, not after matching Ketchell's record, he then beats Ketchell's record, becoming first 3-time middleweight champion in history. He then defends it, beating Bobo Olsen in another fight on the bounce, again stopping him in the early rounds, before then, a few fights later, losing it to Gene Fullmer, who was top 3 middleweight. He then comes back and scores one of great one-punch knockouts against Gene Fullmer in the 5th round, moving backwards to knock out top 3 rated Gene Fullmer, another Hall of Famer, to become the middleweight champion of the world for the 4th time. He then loses it to Carmen Basilio on points in a brutally hard fight over 15 rounds. Basilio, the #1 middleweight in world, welterweight champion. Robinson loses it, but then in the 2nd Ring Magazine Fight of the Year on the bounce against Basilio, Robinson breaks his own record for the 2nd time, becoming a 5-time middleweight champion. So he matched Ketchell's record, then became a 3-time champion, then broke his own record to become a 4-time champion, then broke his own record to become a 5-time champion. He finally lost it, okay, to the tough Paul Pender, who's a very good fighter, who was rated #1 at middleweight. He was on a 10-fight unbeaten run. He lost the title, then failed to re-win the undisputed title against Paul Pender. He then had 2 more fights with top 3 rated Gene Fullmer, drew and lost one. But even after that, you know, he went on to fight top 10 middleweight Denny Moyer, okay, gaining a win. He then lost to top 10 rated middleweight, former light middleweight champion Denny Moyer, then lost to top 10 rated middleweight, you know, Teddy Downs, a former world champion himself, beat top 5 rated welterweight Ralph Dupow, was also around that time an undisputed light middleweight champion, lost to another great middleweight, Joey Giardello, okay, who was the #1 rated middleweight in the world, went on to lose to Joey Archer. But basically what we have there in his middleweight title fights is Jake LaMotta, Randy Turpin, Bobo Olsen, Rocky Graziano, okay, Bobo Olsen, Fulmer, Basilio, Pender, Fulmer. That is probably the toughest run of consistent middleweight title fights in boxing history. And the fact he had multiple Ring Magazine fights that year, the fact he had the adversity of losing to some of these Hall of Fame fighters, all of them, from Turpin, LaMotta, Olsen, Fulmer, Basilio, all of them Hall of Famers, he would come back and beat them to break his own records. You know, to me, Robinson is the #1 middleweight of all time. Without, you know, the title accomplishments are too great on Robinson for him to be anywhere else. And another point I'd like to make out, he was first rated at middleweight, 2nd at middleweight in 1949. That is 2 years before he won the middleweight title. Then, when he became rated again at middleweight in 1950, he was top 3 rated at middleweight until 1959. 5 of those years, he was the #1 middleweight in the world. And even past his prime would still be a top 10 rated middleweight, based on the fact that, yes, he would lose some big fights to Joey Archer, Giardello. He lost to Moyer. He also beat Moyer. He beat Ralph Dupow. So he could lose fights, but he could still also beat a lot of fighters and still score knockouts as well. To me, Ray Robinson, with that 5-time middleweight all, the list, the title record is full of Hall of Famers and great fighters, and some at best middleweights. You know, many top 20 middleweights of all time. To me, that's why I have him #1. Talk over, babble over. I'll let Scrap jump in or random.
Go for it, Scrap.
What a breakdown that was, BL. You said it all, man. I want to clarify something, and then I go into Ray Robinson, because I have him #1 as well. Jake LaMotta was already a professional by that time. He turned professional in 41, actually, and he got his license in 1940. And 39 was the year. And what was interesting about that year, Ray Robinson had faced a fighter by the name of Lou Spider Valentine. He won the 1939 featherweight Golden Glove. Jake LaMotta won the 1939 Diamond Gloves in the light heavyweight division. Goes to show you how interesting their saga was when they faced each other between 42 and 51. So here's Ray Robinson. Here's my take on him. When he turned professional, October 4th, 1940, he turned professional as a lightweight. Now, his first opportunity for a title shot was actually in 41. It was against Sammy Angot. Sammy Angot, a lot of people don't know this detail. He got Ray Robinson to agree on something, because, see, he didn't want to give his title up to Ray Robinson. So what he did was, he came in overweight, 136 1/4 pounds. And he told Ray Robinson, look, I'm overweight. Because they give you, you have the weigh in that day, and they give you an hour or a couple of hours to make the weight. So he told Ray Robinson, look, man, nobody else is going to give you a shot. If you come in on your weight, they're going to strip me from my title. If they do that, you'll never get a shot. I'm just here to tell you this. We can make money and you can get an opportunity to win the title. But if you don't go for it, so what he did was, he went back, ate a couple of sandwiches. He came back weighing 136 as Sami Zayn got there. So what it did was, and it was in contingency that once he got his weight right, he would get another opportunity to fight Sami Zayn for that lightweight championship crown. Well, Sami Zayn got then retired because he knew that he had to stay out of the ring for a couple months and come back again. And that contract agreement will be over with. People don't know this, but this is what happened. So then same thing happens to him with Marty Servo. In 42, Marty Servo had defeated Freddie Red Hot Crane. Freddie Red Hot Crane had defeated Fizzy Zivik. Zivik obviously defeated Henry Armstrong. Marty Servo had lost to Ray Robinson twice. So he didn't want to give Ray Robinson the third opportunity in 46 when the war was over. So when he fought he fought Rocky Graziano instead of Ray Robinson. Rocky Graziano potentially broken his nose, and he said, "To hell with this, I'm retiring," because he didn't want to fight Ray Robinson. Everybody knew that back at that time. So Ray Robinson gets an opportunity to fight who was originally the ranked number 7 fighter, and they moved him up to ranking number 3, was Tommy Bell out of Ohio. He defeated Tommy Bell December 20th, 1946. And that was a hell of a fight, man. Robinson got dropped, and the whole place, they lost their breath because they couldn't believe that Robinson was on one knee in this case. Now, Ray Robinson has been down before. Artie Levine, and he was down by Jake LaMotta. And, you know, he's been down before. But this was the crucial moment of his career. And he got up and he displayed one of the greatest boxing exhibitions under pressure that anybody has ever seen. He wound up becoming the welterweight champion of the world. So now he gets an opportunity to fight Jake LaMotta at middleweight because he already had his tango with Jake LaMotta in 42, 43, 44, and 45. Now in 51, he gets his opportunity with him for the championship title. A lot went on by getting this fight because he had to wind up fighting Lorenzo Tio. And everybody thought that, oh my God, Robinson's not going to get his shot because he's going to lose to this Frenchman. And it turns out he wound up knocking out the Tio, and I think it was like 15 seconds before the fight was over. He fights Marcel Sedan. He couldn't get out of that fight because it was part of the agreement he had with the mob. And speaking of Jake LaMotta, when he lost to Blackjack Billy Fox at New York's Madison Square Garden in 1947. So he had to fight Marcel Sedan. But the agreement was, look, now I got a big fight here with Ray Robinson. Now, Marcel Sedan doesn't know anything about this. However, somebody obviously spoke to Sedan because he did not come out for the 10th round. Jake LaMotta had taken the $20,000 and he bet it on himself. And all of a sudden, Marcel Sedan doesn't come out for the 10th round. And then when he comes back from Casablanca, where he was from, to re-sign the original agreement that he had. It was supposed to be, I win one, you win one, but it's plane crash. Some of the greatest fighters of all time that I'm going to mention to you who accomplished what he did. 1940, he graduated out of amateurs with some of the greatest fighters of all time. Willie Pep, Ezard Charles, Jimmy Bivens, Ike Williams, himself, another fighter by the name of Cleo Shane. Now, all of the fighters that I just mentioned to you, besides Jimmy Bivens, well, he won a duration, a light heavyweight and heavyweight title, but as far as a world title, were Ike Williams, Willie Pep, Ray Robinson, and Ezard Charles. All of those men turned professional in 1940. They all won titles, and they all lost them in the same year, 1951. Ike Williams lost to Jimmy Carter. Willie Pep lost to Sandy Sadler. Ezard Charles had lost to Jersey Joe Walcott. Ray Robinson lost to Jake LaMotta. Now, if you want to include Jake LaMotta in 1940, as I do, then he turned professional in 40 because that's when he got his license, and he lost his title in 51. The only fighter who regained his title in 51 was the legendary great fighter, Sugar Ray Robinson. And that's why I have him number 1, as well as BL does, because Ray Robinson is very underrated. He BL, I mean, he explains so much more than I just did to you as far as all his rematches are concerned. But here's a man who actually took chances, went up to 52 to take on Joey Maxim. And he was winning the fight as a welterweight. That's really what he was. He was really a welterweight, to be honest with you. He shed all that weight during the heat. Ruby Goldstein had to be escorted out of the ring. In comes Ray Miller, who was an outstanding lightweight from Chicago. And Ray Robinson just got exhausted and he couldn't come out for the 14th round. So Joey Maxim keeps his title. That same year, Archie Moore takes on Joey Maxim and he wins the light heavyweight championship belt and holds it for 10 years. So this goes to show you. But Ray Robinson was a hell of a fighter. I have him ranked #1 as the middleweights. And if given an opportunity, I want to explain one guy I left out because I had no choice to. But BL, that was a great breakdown, brother. Great breakdown.
Oh, thank you, Scrapbook. Appreciate that.
Yeah, what a wonderful tribute, guys. Thank you both very much. And also, thanks again to people listening after the fact. Drop your opinions in the comments. It's all very subjective. I definitely took a subjective approach because I wasn't sure quite how to handle all the information. So for my #1, it's probably obvious by now. It was close between him and Ray Robinson, but I went with the great Harry Greb, and I'm going to explain why. Whether it's fair or not, like certain fighters, when they start to be the same size or smaller than their opponents, that's like Ray Robinson was one of the great welterweights of all time, and I have him among the greatest welterweights ever, and then moved up and became one of the greatest, and to these two gentlemen, the greatest middleweight of all time. With Harry Greb, he spent a lot of his career as a middleweight, beating both middleweights, light heavyweights, and heavyweights. Now, at a middleweight and light heavyweight level, he has an incomparable bag of Hall of Fame wins. And at heavyweight, he was a contender. In fact, he was a contender. He fought Gunboat Smith in, I think it was 1920. Smith, Dempsey had beaten, I can't remember who he'd just beaten, but he signaled a willingness, according to this one promoter, to fight Gunboat, but they needed to match him with a heavyweight, so he fought Greb. Greb stopped him very quickly, called out Dempsey, and never got the fight, even though he kept winning. But just to visually show, so like early in Greb's career, he was a little bit lighter. BL, when would you say, was it 14 or 15 when he was in the middleweight ranks properly?
I'd say 1915. When he turned pro about 141 pounds, and he spent about 12 to 18 months with his training. He started morphing into a full-blown middleweight. I'd say 1915. Oh,
thank you, sir. Yeah, so you see here, he's got some wins and losses, but he's just getting ramped up. He's filling into middleweight. But as you go through Greb's career, keep it in mind, until the very end of his career, he was able to make middleweight. So I count that in like with Langford, even if he didn't always cut down below the limit of the time, they were walking around as a middleweight. So I'm just looking at great middleweights. Ray Robinson, phenomenal, but Greb was not only doing great things at middleweight, he was doing great things at light heavyweight and some pretty badass things at heavyweight. He was one of the top contenders to Dempsey. Around the time Tommy Gibbons was the other top contender at the time that Greb was considered that. And he had no business being a heavyweight contender on paper, but it was just his fight style and his toughness and his pacing, his sense of rhythm and timing. He's one of those guys like Langford who's able to just hold it together in the face of size disadvantages in quite a remarkable way. But as his career went on, he suffered the occasional setback. He didn't have the unbroken run all the time. You can see some of the names on here where he's fighting guys like Jeff Smith and Jack Dillon, Mike McTeague, and battling Levinsky, Billy Misk, and just a summary of his career. And look, this right here is a respectable career on its own, standalone year. Well, he's a middleweight, but he's also beating Hall of Fame light heavyweights and heavyweight contenders all in one year. So this is probably what edged it for me, is the fact that 1919 he lost his last fight in 1918, but 1919 going into 1920 until the loss to Gibbons, which is his only loss of that year. That's an insane combined record. And the pace of his career, he died young, so he didn't fight late into life like Robinson and Langford and some of these others. But what he did, and it just keeps going. It just keeps going on and on and on. Tommy Loughran, Jeff Smith again, Tommy Gibbons, Gene Tunney. The only loss Gene Tunney got in his career. And BL, I'd heard you mention something a couple years ago in a live where you were talking about when you're trying to narrow down, and you were saying, well, whose opponents could the other guys beat? And to me, Langford's the extreme example, but as far as just looking at middleweights, Greb beat some guys who I think would beat these other guys. And so that maybe edged it for him to #1. and it keeps going. Forgetting I'm leaving out 3 years of work. And he fought basically up to his death or close to his death. You know, he's having surgery, some sort of reaction to anesthesia, and he passed away sadly, coming off a loss to the great Tiger Flowers. But what an incredible fighter. And everyone on this list were immeasurably great fighters. And there are lots of guys who didn't make any of our lists who are great fighters. So I'm glad we didn't have a criteria. It got us to celebrate different people in different ways. And and certainly like Robinson, it could, you know, maybe on a different day. One of my 3 lists, to be honest, Robinson was number 1. And Hagler and Monzon were switched on a couple of lists. It was all pretty tough for me, especially as a more recent convert to like studying boxing history. Just a few years in, like three years and change into doing this. But gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for your time and the effort that you obviously, because I know there's a lot of hand wringing when you're talking all time and you're putting your information out there, putting your opinions out there. And we might all have a different list if we made another one tomorrow. Maybe some of the spots would stay the same, but I'm sure some other guys, because you definitely give me a lot to think about. Lots of great fighters didn't make any of the lists, but any closing thoughts, guys, before we call it?
I'll go. No, I've really enjoyed this chat. I've been looking forward to it ever since we discussed it and agreed to it. I'd like to maybe consider doing another top 10, like the light heavyweights. That'd be an interesting one. But I think these chats, I'm sure Scrap and Random will both agree with, these chats are really important on social media because we present a lot of information. We highlight different fighters. Some of these fighters who we've mentioned here or there, not all boxing fans may be as familiar with them. And, you know, by speaking on them and speaking on them well for the great careers that they had and the great skills they had and the great accomplishments they set, you know, hopefully we'll reach other minds and stimulate other minds to learn about these fighters. And, you know, we all look at boxing different. We have different top 10s. We have similar top 10s in some ways, different in others. But that kind of shows the great variety that the sport has, as well as the variety of our opinions on the great fighters in the sport, because it is the sport to me with the richest, deepest and most mesmerizing history of any sport I know of. Boxing is so deep and goes back even to where I look at 130 plus years. You know, the history is amazing. So many great fighters. So it's really a privilege when I join you know, guys like yourselves and really have a chance to have these in-depth discussions. I'd just like to say a big appreciation to both of you and look forward to many more in the future.
It's great having you, sir. Scrapbook, any closing thoughts, my friend?
Yes, PL, it was more than a pleasure, obviously, doing a live with you. It's really means a lot. Random as well. Could I ask a favor of you? Could you put up a picture for me with the Harlem Thunderbolt, Harry Smith, if you don't mind? I just want to just say a quick comment on him because he was not in the top 10, but he's worthy of it. And I'll explain quickly why, if you don't mind. Thank you. The reason why is because the Harlem Thunderbolt, he had won the colored middleweight championship belt, which was very interesting in 1929 at the Athletic Club against Jack McVeigh, who was known as the Pride of Harlem. And he had a record of 65-0 with 55 knockouts coming out of the amateurs. He won the light heavyweight championship in Canada. He won the middleweight championship, which is the Metropolitan AAU. The only other fighter to do that, but he did it at bantamweight, was Ray Robinson, and that was in 1938. So the Harlem Thunderbolt was an outstanding fighter. I wanted to put him on the list, but I couldn't because I had to choose Homan Williams because Homan Williams deserved the kind of shine that I felt a number 10 rated fighter deserved. One other fighter I just want to mention was Theodore Tiger Flowers. I couldn't choose him, unfortunately, because, again, I had to choose Charlie Burley. But Theodore Tiger Flowers was an outstanding fighter. Just goes to show you what kind of man he really was. Here's a man, January 1st, 1922 to December 22nd, 1922. He had 21 bouts. Kid Norfolk twice, Eddie Palmer twice, Kid Davis twice, Jamaica Kid, Sam Langford, Lee Anderson. I mean, this type of resume, it just goes to show you. In 1925, he fought Lee Anderson. Guess what? He fought him twice on June 8th, the same day. He fought him the first time. It was and Lee Anderson wound up becoming the future light heavyweight champion. which is really amazing. And that's when Theodore Tiger Flowers tried for that title. They both fought for the vacant light heavyweight championship, the color division. And then he fought him again later on that afternoon, and he wound up winning on a disqualification in the third round. And it was at the Commonwealth Sporting Club in New York. But just things like that, I just wanted to bring to the attention, because Flowers and Harry Smith was worthy men that needed to be on his list. He would wind up becoming the middleweight champion of the world when he would defeat Harry Greb in 1926, and then he lost it to Mickey Walker. All Hall of Famers there. But the last man I just wanted to mention was Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Everyone's going to want, and I have to do this because they're going to question my integrity. Why am I not putting Marvin Hagler on there? Marvin Hagler, I could not put on there because he was already put on by you guys, and I thank you very much. But the reason why I put him on there is because his career is, he has the saddest middleweight career of all times, in my opinion, because he was in the shadows of Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, and Roberto Duran. In 1980, when he wound up winning the middleweight championship belt from Alan Minter, no one made a big deal about it because Ray Leonard fought Roberto Duran, lost him in New Orleans, and then he defeated him in Montreal, or vice versa. He lost to him in Montreal and he defeated him in New Orleans. Then in 1981, when he wound up facing Vito Antuofermo in a rematch, and he stopped him in 3 rounds because of cuts, Freddie Brown wound up deciding to stop the fight. They didn't make an issue of that. Why? Because in 1981, Ray Leonard had faced Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Yeah. So this is the kind of problem he was having. Sugar Ray Seals, who was the 1973 gold medalist in the Olympic Games. Well, Marvin Hagler turned professional in 1973. Nobody paid attention to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, although he was an outstanding amateur himself. So, it's just so many. We can do this all day with Marvelous Marvin Hagler. That's why he doesn't get the credit I believe that he deserves. He didn't fully get credit until his last 3 fights. And that was one with Thomas the Hitman Hearns in 85, excuse me. I was at that fight. And in 86, when he fought Mugabe, he almost lost. But because of his grit, he wound up pulling out that fight. Mugabe was 26-0 with 26 knockouts coming into that fight, and he wound up knocking him out. And then when he lost to Ray Leonard in 87, and he was not undisputed at that time because they stripped him from 2 belts for taking a fight with Ray Leonard. So that's why I didn't put him on the list. I had to choose some other guys, but he's definitely my top 10. I have him rated 2 or 1. Just wanted to say that. Thanks for the opportunity for me to explain that.
No, it's all good. And if I can just jump in random straight away, Scrapbook's Pete, something to mention. Fighters that Scrapbook mentioned, Jeff Smith and Emil Griffith, they'd all be in my top 20 at some point, as would Tiger Flowers. I'd also like to shout out other really good middleweight fighters like Fred Apostoli, the dangerous puncher. Other fighters like Teddy Roz, Ken Overlin. The middleweight division is a rich division going back a long way. Some of these fighters like Apostoli, Overlin, and Uroz, Teddy Uroz, were very hard fighters to beat, were very dangerous fighters, had stacked resumes top to bottom, fought many top-level fighters and scored many top-level wins, and even many wins over Hall of Famers. They called Ken Overlin poor man's Harry Greb. He was a guy who Ezard Charles struggled to beat. We're talking about a fighter who Ezard Charles struggled against. He had difficult fights with Ken Overlin. He had, not much easier fights with Teddy Uroz. So, when you look at these guys, Apostoli, Dundee, Teddy Uroz, Overlin, and many other middleweights from that time, added to fighters that Scrapbook's highlighted, like Griffith and Jeff Smith and Flowers. These are some of the other fighters who would make up my top 20. But I'm quite sure, like you two guys, I could easily have a deeper thing, swap them around a bit, and enhance my list. But, when you're looking at many of these fighters, some of these fighters are some of the greatest fighters in middleweight history. They just sadly all couldn't get in my top 10 because of certain reasons here or there on other fighters. But that's why, added to what Scrap said, that's why these conversations are great, for that diversity of thought.
Yeah, this has been extremely gratifying. I'm going to actually listen back to it at work tonight. And this is, it's important to remember everything's subjective. And depending on, like, if we had set a criteria, like some guidelines, we might have had more similar lists, but keeping it broad like this, you know, even 3 completely separate different lists would have been just fine, because we're celebrating different kinds of greatness. And like you said, BL, a sport with a history this rich, there have been so many greats, and there are greats being added all the time. We see guys doing great things today, you know, some of the undisputed status that's been attained and things like that, weight jumpers and people even like Canelo, like great champion, moving up to challenge himself against a champion. And, you know, the lineage continues. There are always more and more great fighters. And these recent Hall of Fame inductees, you know, is just solidifying the greatness of, you know, guys like Jones and Tony that deserve their credit, and all the people, the various people. It's a vast sport, and going all the way back, this was incredibly difficult, but it was very, very gratifying intellectually to even try and wrestle with these resumes. And like you said, tons of guys who didn't make the list, but they're powerful. They make their arguments, you know, like Uraz, and for me, like Williams made a good argument. I definitely thought about Jeff Smith. There are just so many great fighters at middleweight, you know, Dick Tiger, I think Dave Shade, I'm pretty sure, BL, in your rankings, like, he's someone who appears at the top of the pile or near the top of the pile in lots of years. Like, he spent Dave, underrated.
Dave Shade, he won at best welterweight and middleweights at 20s. He's now enshrined in Hall of Fame. He fought a who's who of everybody across 2 weight divisions and was a very difficult fighter to beat at his best. Very underrated fighter historically, very, very deep resume indeed, and a very capable fighter, Dave Shade. He's certainly a fighter from that time who gets a bit underappreciated, like a fighter that Scrapbook mentioned, Jack McVeigh, who Harry Greb did actually try to fight on one Independence Day. Greb were all up for the fight, but the authorities said, no way, Jose, and they wouldn't allow the fight to happen. They even threatened Greb would be arrested if he tried to go through a fight, which was sad, because to me, Harry Greb fighting an underappreciated black fighter, but a very good black fighter indeed, on American Independence Day, would have been a powerful statement for that diversity. And, you know, to coin Benny Leonard's phrase, this is competition, sport, and in sport, anybody can get an opportunity. You know, that's what Leonard coined before he fought former coloured lightweight champion Leo Johnson. And Greb, you know, sadly didn't get to have that fight with Jack McVeigh, which would have been an awesome fight. Scrapbook knows Jack McVeigh well, and he knows that, you know, he could fight. He had stamina, he was durable, he was a good fighter. That'd have been a hell of a battle. But, you know, this is why talking about these great fighters is so important.
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
job. I think one last thing and I'm done. I know we got to go, guys. I just want to finish up with this last note. Thank you. With Marvelous Marvin Hagler, 1978 was one of the greatest years for boxing, because you had Ali and Spinks twice. You had Holmes and Norton. I mean, you had Holmes and Shavers, Bad Benny Briscoe and Marvelous Marvin Hagler, which I was at that fight at the Philadelphia Spectrum. You had Yaki Lopez and Matusad Muhammad. So 1978, he was overshadowed. 79, he was overshadowed because he's on the undercard of Ray Leonard and with a Benitez. And he fought Vito Anafermo. And not only was he on the undercard of that, but he wound up getting a draw. So this is the problem Marvin Hagler had, where he wasn't the face of the middleweights, which is a shame for him. I mean, almost 7 years, you know, unbelievable. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure having you both, and I am going to call it because I now have to get ready for work. And I just want to thank you, thank the listeners, the guys in the chat, the regulars. Thank you so much for participating. I read the comments. I didn't get too much into it because I already figured this would be somewhere between 2 or 3 hours, and I am on a timer, which I'm just bumping up against right now. So thank you both. And thank you, everybody. And I hope you just have a fantastic day. And if we've inspired anybody to just look into some of these fighters, then that's all right there. It makes everything worth it, beyond the individual gratification we get from talking about greatness in combat sports. So, gentlemen, thank you so much.
If I may, I'd just like to quickly say thank you to Scrap and Random. Thank you very much to listeners. Hope you've enjoyed.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Have a great day now.